Story number 1. I didn't plan to stop. I planned to vanish. The road was supposed to erase me, mile by mile, until even my name felt like a mistake someone else made. Then the sign for a diner cut through the rain, and I told myself I'd only step inside long enough to warm my hands. 5 minutes became a story that still owns my nights. If you ever pass Route 82 after midnight, remember this: the road watches back, and some promises are just traps with better manners. I walked in from weather that turned the asphalt into a dark mirror. The room smelled like coffee and bleach, a tired combination that made me think of bus stations and second chances. A jukebox glowed in the corner, dead on the inside, loud on the outside. It projected color without music. A perfect metaphor for me. I slid into a booth, counted the crumpled bills in my pocket, and ordered the cheapest thing that wouldn't poison me. A man in a faded trucker's cap watched from the far end of the counter. Not curious, not kind, just measuring. His attention felt like a gauge near the red, steady and exact. When the server refilled my cup, he rose and took the seat across from me, as if the table had been waiting for him.
"You look like a boy who ran out of map," he said. "Name's Roy."
He didn't ask for mine. I didn't offer it. The windows shook. The light turned the raindrops silver for a heartbeat and charcoal the next. He tipped his chin toward the glass, then toward my cup. "Rough night for hitchhiking."
I wanted to say it's a rough night for everything but breathing, but I just nodded. I told him I had miles to go and not enough gas or courage to cover them. He took that in and did the oddest thing. He leaned closer, like I was a radio he had to tune by proximity. "Ever hear about the Night Rider?"
I shook my head, and he told me anyway, because men like Roy always tell the story. They tell it the way truckers tell weather, a moving fact, a forecast you ignore at your own cost. "There's a girl out there," he said. "Some say ghost, some say not even that. They call her the one in the red jacket. Thumb out, head down, long hair, wet or dry depending on what the sky wants. If you stop, you don't get where you're going." I tried to treat it like diner theater, hot coffee, cold, legend, but his voice put a splinter under my fingernail. He talked about Route 82, the stretch of country that connects Amarillo to Tulsa if you've made bad choices and worse luck. About a black Chevy with a busted tail light and a windshield shattered by something no one could describe without looking smaller. About the morning, the car turned up abandoned in a ditch. The passenger seat wet as if rain had been invited inside. The story never used her name. The story always used her color. "People laugh," he said. "Then they see the rearview mirror." He told it without performance, as if the narrative had been sanded smooth by repetition until it could slide into anyone. And when he finished, he added the one thing that felt like an address. I picked her up. I told him that if he wanted to scare me, it was working, but I needed details if I was going to rearrange my plans. He obliged. A county road, rain that turned fences into rough lines in a pencil sketch, a girl in red, shoulders rounded like she'd been taught to occupy less space than she deserved. She got in. She said nothing. The heat gave up. The dashboard flickered. The radio died quietly like an apology. He took a curve, looked over, and saw a face that did not belong to the living or to an explanation. "I never opened the door," he said. "But the seat, you could see where she'd been." He stared at my cup, not at me. "That was the last time I offered a ride. He asked me to promise I'd keep walking if I saw anyone out there who cleaned the air just by being in it. He said police liked clean endings, accidents, runaways, bad luck. But people who lived under the weather knew better. I promised, because promising is a way of stalling. And I wasn't ready to return to the rain. I stayed until the server counted the register, until the lights felt like a warning flare. And then I left with my shoulders hunched against the wind and the geography of what I'd just heard. That was the last time I saw Roy, or the first. Stories tend to curve back on themselves if you drive far enough. Years turned me into someone with a different spine. I found work where the days were long and the nights had an honest cold. I kept moving because stillness is a mirror nobody enjoys. One spring, I took a delivery job that would have made younger me proud for the wrong reasons. Miles, pay, no questions. The route was printed in black ink, but the road it chose had memory. My second run took me west by the old asphalt ribbon truckers prefer because it behaves like it wants you alive. I knew the number. I refused the legend. That's the lie I told myself. The highways were mostly empty, but rumor kept me company, and past midnight, fog wrote its name across the lanes. Whipple. I told myself I'd pull over if my eyelids did that heavy dance. And then I saw her the way a sentence appears on a page, all at once and perfectly legible. Figure at the shoulder, red jacket, thumb set like punctuation. I touched the brakes because mercy is a reflex I haven't unlearned. The cab filled with cold, colder than the weather had earned. The dash dimmed, the headlights thinned to a kind of patient light that waited to see what I would do next. I stopped. She climbed in without asking, which felt like an answer to a question I hadn't risked. Close up, she looked both younger and older than the distance allowed. Her hair fell forward. Water threaded the strands. The passenger seat accepted her weight and the truck listed a fraction. Evidence of mass. She kept her face turned toward the window as if I were a scary painting she didn't want to explain, and I said my name. She did not say hers. I drove. We reached the county line and the road tilted over a low hill that authorities call a grade because it is smaller than a mountain and larger than a lie. The temperature inside dropped again. My hand started arguing with the steering wheel. I told a joke about coffee being a religion where I come from. I mentioned Tulsa and Amarillo, like saying the words could draw borders she had to obey. She remained the quiet at the center of a storm. And then, because I am human, I looked over. I didn't see a face. I saw a fact. An absence wearing a shape. A scream taught how to sit still. The windshield glossed with moisture from the inside. The rear view mirror tried to interpret her and failed. For half a mile, the truck traveled a road that wasn't on the map. I felt it as a highway under the tires and at the same time as stairs I couldn't climb. I pressed the brake. When the truck shuddered to a stop, the door locks slid down. I didn't touch them. The radio spoke a single name on the fogged glass, drawn by a finger I didn't see. And this is the part of the story where everything I was became everything I would have to answer for. I knew the word, and I knew Roy's face from that night in the diner. His eyes had the same weight as the one now, typing itself across the glass. She turned her head. What I saw was not cruelty. It was a ledger. She was adding me up. She was deciding whether to carry the remainder forward. I kept walking. I said, my voice made no sense in that air. I kept walking. The locks rose. The door opened as if nudged by someone outside. The seat cooled. She was gone. Only the crease remained. The footprint of a person who had borrowed gravity for a few minutes. I drove, and I did not look back. Not because I'm brave, but because I know when the truth will turn me into kindling. The next stop on my route was a truck stop that believed in pancakes and mercy. I parked under a sodium lamp, sat with a map I didn't need. A woman 2 stools over asked if I'd seen the one in red. I told her I didn't believe in stories. That's not what I asked, she said. Her hands were rough from work and careful with her cup. Heard a man named Roy used to warn people. Heard he knew why she stayed out there. My stomach performed math I couldn't show. I found a motel with a key that outlived its lock and tried to sleep. The rear-view mirror inside my head kept showing me 2 lanes, empty except for the weight of a decision I hadn't made yet. Morning made cowfields out of the dark. I dropped the load at a warehouse where everyone smiled with their mouth and nowhere else. On the way back, I pulled into a county library that wore its budget on its bricks. I started reading old newspapers, missing persons, a girl last seen in a thrift store red jacket who never got where she was headed, a young freight driver questioned and released, anonymous tips that weren't, a black Chevy with a busted tail light tied to a different crash 2 counties over, registers with names scratched out, a page that looked like it wanted to confess. That evening, I retraced the route because cowardice, too, is a circle. At the same turnout where I'd stopped, an old marker leaned wishhol. Its paint sloughed off by weather. Someone had carved 3 straight lines into the wooden post. The way prisoners count days, I touched them like a priest makes a sign. The wind lifted. The road went quiet in that way that means it's listening. And then I understood the thing I had been trying not to think. Roy's warning wasn't charity. It was a confession disguised as kindness. I drove back to the diner. Not the same one, but its sister in spirit. All neon and coffee steam and resigned air. I told the story to a counterman with a face like a locked drawer. When I said Roy, he looked at the calendar like he could flip a page and make my words be about someone else. Old boy did used to sit in that corner, he said, finally. Talked like he was trying to pay a debt he didn't owe. He paused. Or maybe he did. I went quiet for the rest of the drive. Quiet as a hallway, after the last patient goes home. In that silence, the girl in red sat with me without being in the seat. She wasn't asking for rescue, she was asking for exact change. Night put its hands over the world again. I should have kept going. Instead, I pulled over where the asphalt thins and the dirt starts telling it the truth. I stood by the road and said the promise out loud, the one Roy asked me for, and the one the radio repeated. If I see someone who doesn't belong, I keep walking. I don't open the door. My breath marked the air. The road didn't answer. The headlights of a far car lifted and fell away. I added a sentence. But if I learn the name of the man who left her there, I bring him back. The wind moved through the grass like a thing remembering how to be alive. The temperature rose. I got the message. She didn't want me to keep walking. She wanted me to stop the right person from moving at all. People think police handle justice. No, sometimes they handle paperwork. The justice we get is usually the justice someone is willing to carry. I started making calls. Old friends who lived where I didn't anymore. A union steward who knew everybody's worst secret and half of their middle names. A cousin who worked dispatch and could read a route slip like a biography. One thread led to another. I built a web on a yellow legal pad until the names began to lean toward one. Royden, a face that, once seen, refuses to forget you. I drove to the only house the web supported, a shack that used to dream about being a cottage. The yard was an argument between rust and weeds. A truck under a tarp showed a busted tail light when the wind lifted the plastic like a curtain. I didn't break in. I waited. Sunset bled out. A man walked up the path, carrying groceries and silence.
You look older, I said, but I think I know who you are.
He set the bag down carefully, like one bad move could trigger a landslide. He didn't deny. He didn't confirm. He did the thing men do when there are only 2 exits and both of them lead to a story someone else will tell. He asked whether I wanted coffee. Inside, the place smelled like dust and apology. He sat. I stood. There isn't a polite way to show someone the ledger that has their name on it. I told him about my pickups, my drop-offs, my habit of reading archives when sleep won't have me. I told him I had promised a girl in red that I would bring the right person back to Route 82. He said my name like he had found it written on a crowbar. You don't know the half of it, he said, and then he did what he did years ago, in another diner. He told a version designed to fit into his hands. Back then he was 22 and learning how to be large without being dangerous. He found it easier to be dangerous. He picked up a girl because she looked like someone. The night had chosen to punish for nothing. He didn't touch her. He swore, but his friend in the passenger seat did. And the argument went the way those arguments go when the road is empty and the nearest help is a rumor, the Chevy, the ditch, the blood, panic, write strange sentences. They ran. He drove. He had been running ever since, warning strangers because he didn't know how to warn himself. There are confessions that beg for punishment. There are confessions that beg for a rerun of the past where someone chooses better. I had no gift to give him from either category. I said I knew a road that had been waiting a very long time. He nodded. We rode in my truck without speaking. He watched the rear view mirror as if it could warn him about the future. When we reached the turnout, I pulled onto the shoulder. The grass remembered our tire marks like a signature. I told him he could walk or stay. He opened the door before I finished the sentence, halfway to the post with the carved lines. He stopped and turned. She wore a red jacket, he said, as if I didn't know. I still carry the button I found in the seat when I tried to pretend I hadn't been there. She knows, I said. The air thickened the way it does before a storm. Except the sky was clean, so the temperature fell. Then rose. Then settled into a kind of decision. He looked smaller, not physically, but like math done correctly at last. He took the button from his pocket and set it on the fence post. I won't run, he said. Not anymore. I stayed at the truck because the road didn't ask for me. The shape that came down the shoulder wore red that wasn't fabric. It was memory dyed into the world. She stopped beside him, and the two of them were a photograph taken by a camera with no film. He spoke. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the posture people use when they apologize without asking for anything back. She lifted her hand to his chest and left it there long enough for him to accept gravity. Then she stepped away and kept walking, as if all she had ever wanted was the truth to stand still long enough to be counted. He stayed. He sat on the ground. He did not run. I made the call. The police came with lights and paperwork. They asked me for a narrative that would fit inside a report. I gave them the version that would keep everyone employable. Accidents, runaways, bad luck. The officer wrote it all down, grateful for a world that could be weary without being strange. By dawn, a tow truck had the Chevy, and a judge had a promise from a man who finally knew how to pay a debt. I took a last pass down Route 82. The headlights felt brighter than they had any right to be. I watched the shoulder, out of habit or hope, I couldn't say. No figure waited. The road looked like a thing that had learned how to heal. That night, in another town no story has claimed yet, I sat at a counter and said the name Caleb to a server who didn't ask for it. I told the man 2 stools down about the girl and the debt that finally found its debtor. I included the part novices always forget. The revenge wasn't the point. The point was balance. The kind you feel in your bones when it's missing, and the kind you don't notice when it's there.
You want a moral? I don't trust morals. I trust choices. Here's mine. When the road offers me company now, I ask who else has to pay for it. If it's only me, I open the door. If it costs someone who already owes too much, I keep it shut. There are lines we inherit and lines we draw. I learned to tell them apart while a girl in red walked away from a man who finally stopped.
Drivers still vanish on lonely stretches, their cars found abandoned, their fates distributed between gossip and official statements. And maybe some are just what the file says, maybe some aren't. But if you ever find yourself at the edge of town where the neon falters and the radio talks to itself, and if a stranger offers you a story like a seatbelt, consider buckling in, because some rides you don't come back from, and some you do, but you return measured, like a truck weighed at a station by a man who knows the difference between empty and honest. Story number 2. I took one last fare and surrendered the night to a stranger. He slid into my back seat with a suitcase that seemed to swallow the cabin light. He had pale eyes that didn't search so much as measure, as if my future were a number he already knew. When he finally spoke, a single word caged the rest of my breaths. Drive.
By morning, the app insisted the ride was completed, but I still hadn't found my way back.
My name is Lena, and I used to navigate strangers for money. I liked the rules because they were simple. A dot becomes a face becomes a tip, and a tip becomes rent. That night, the rules behaved, and then they didn't. The request appeared without an address, a clean blue banner with no destination, only a single initial for a name. It came from a quiet fringe of the map where industry had died and left its bones, corrugated hulks, toothless fences, roofs buckling like tired backs. I had driven past this zone a dozen times and pretended it wasn't there. The air over that industrial edge always held a metallic taste, as if a storm were keeping its thoughts to itself. I told myself I'd accept and cancel if the curb felt wrong. That was my private ritual. The turnoff delivered me to a run of cracked asphalt, a gutter that never learned to drain, and a street lamp that tried to hold itself steady and failed. That was where he waited. The person my map had drawn for me. The person the map had also chosen not to explain. Tall, narrow, formal, black suit, white shirt, the exacting neatness of someone who never gets caught by weather. The suitcase hung from his hand like an accusation. "Good evening?" My greeting felt too bright, so I dimmed it. "You're my pickup." He answered with a practiced incline of the head. There are nods that mean yes, nods that mean I'll allow you to think yes, and nods that mean I've already decided what you'll do. He offered the last kind and opened my back door.
I watched the slide of him in my rearview mirror, waiting for the small human hesitations, the shuffle of knees, the search for a belt, a glance at the lock. He kept all the motions, but none of the pauses. My ribcage tightened, as if someone had just notched the strap one hole shorter.
"Where to?" I asked, because that's how you keep the world regular, by asking ordinary questions in an ordinary voice. He looked at the mirror instead of me. If eyes are windows, his were windows of a house no one survived to describe. The silence stretched until it learned how to walk. I checked the screen again. Still no address. Still the blank field where a neighborhood should live. The moving dot that said go and refused to say why. I cleared my throat and tried on a chuckle that didn't fit. "I can't start without the location." He lifted one finger and pointed at the road directly ahead. A gesture so still I wasn't sure I had seen it until it ended. I thought about declining the fare, about telling him the system required a place, about insisting on a protocol no one respects after midnight. Instead, habit climbed into the driver's seat of my body and turned the wheel. We left the warehouse-flanked lanes and fell onto a thinner artery of county pavement. The radio offered me a playlist of voices that would have comforted me any other night, then strangled itself into static. The windows were up, yet the car felt like open water. I checked again for those little human tells, the shift, the sigh, the stray apology. He supplied none. He held the suitcase on his lap, as though it were a lap, as though the bag weighed nothing and everything. My mother once told me that danger never looks like danger until you describe it later. I tried to describe what sat behind me and found only the shape of a sentence without words. The lanes narrowed, the paint dissolved, the reflectors vanished, the town lights behind me forgot what to do with themselves and went out. But I kept driving because stopping is a kind of confession, and I hadn't decided what I was guilty of yet. When the first deer appeared, it did so at the far edge of my high beams and held itself there like a thought I didn't want to have. Its gaze crossed mine and then decided I wasn't worth scaring. I envied that certainty. Finally, I couldn't stand the pressure of not choosing. I eased onto the shoulder, the gravel whispering its opinion against my tires, and faced the back seat. This won't work. I need a place, a sign, house, a town. Now tell me a word I can aim at. He did not blink. I realized I had been waiting for a blink the way you wait for a heartbeat you can count with your palm. He placed the suitcase on his knees and drew the latches. The lid rose, and with it something else. Not a smell, not a color, an absence. I don't have the vocabulary for the quality of that emptiness. Except to say the dark inside the case made the night outside my windows look theatrical. The bag contained void, the way a lung contains air, easily, naturally, as if that were the point. He finally spoke. "Drive." The word wasn't loud, yet it parted everything inside me that could part. I felt the sensation you get when an elevator moves before you think it has. Your bones admit they were wrong. I closed the trunk of my questions, merged back onto the road, and let the night have us. I have driven long stretches where the horizon behaves, where the lines tell you you're still in a world that knows how to be measured. This was not that. Imagine the contours of the familiar. Then rub your hand backward across them till the nap stands up. That was the distance we entered. The forest angled closer, as if petitioning for a verdict. Trees that should have been vertical developed a polite lean toward the lane. The sky dismissed its few remaining stars as if they were interns who had stayed too late. The clouds overlapped like lids. I tried again to negotiate with the normal. If you're nervous, people sometimes type the address wrong. Happens all the time. I was trying to convince myself I belonged to a routine anyone could inhabit. He rested, unmoved. The suitcase opened millimeters now, as though it needed to breathe. At a certain turn, the pavement changed pitch under my tires, and I realized sound had lost its echo. There was no feedback from the world. No confirmation that I existed where the car said I did. If you have never driven through a place that refuses to reflect you, you can't know how quickly your mind invents a second self to keep you company. Mine sat beside me like a responsible twin, correcting my posture, instructing me to check the fuel, to watch the gauges, to pretend I had options. The twin reminded me to keep my movements small so as not to spook what I couldn't name. The first sign we passed had a white face, a generous rectangle of municipal friendliness. No letters, just the cleanliness of a thing that had never been asked to mean. Another stood a mile later and repeated the joke. The third one displayed a single arrow that refused to point anywhere at all. It was an arrow diagramming itself. I laughed once, not the bright bubble of humor, but the laugh that keeps you symmetrical. My hand reached for the mirror. His reflection stayed perfectly framed, as if it had been cut to the aperture and glued there. Some part of me wanted to believe he was a test, a company plant sent to evaluate my patience. Another part of me, the part that knows when a hallway's perspective is wrong, began to count breaths in sets of 4 so I wouldn't count miles. "Do you ever sleep?" I asked. Not because I wanted an answer, but because conversation is a fence you can lean on for a moment. He gently placed his palm on the suitcase lid, and the car dimmed by a degree I felt in my teeth. I refused to look directly at the opening because I suspected the view would be returned. We arrived at a crossroads that didn't deserve the name. The intersecting lane presented itself with the politeness of a waiting room. There were no signs, and yet there were all the signs: emptiness, invitation, the sense of a hallway behind a door you shouldn't open. He lifted a finger again and indicated left. I obeyed before I reasoned, and when I finally asked myself why I'd complied, the reasons I invented sounded like lies even to me. The new road, if road is the word, grew mean. It resented my tires and said so through the wheel. The trees we passed were not the trees we had approached. These bore a density that belonged to oceans, not groves, and somewhere behind me the radio tried to return and gave me one thin bar of a chorus before vanishing into static again. My twin in the passenger seat set her jaw and said, "Not yet. Keep the car between the edges. Keep your name where you can reach it." He did not touch me. He did not threaten. He did not offer the comfort of a reason. He only traveled while I carried him. And the open suitcase traveled too. a negative mouth waiting without hunger, which was worse. Hunger at least requests. This was patience that had already eaten. I have heard people say that dread is a future emotion, that it points to what might happen. I learned it can also be a present tense weather, a barometric truth your body reads before you translate. My teeth ached the way they do when you chew aluminum foil by accident. The words I had once used to make the world behave, mile, lane, county, curb, fell asleep inside my head and refused to get up. When the temperature dropped, I didn't see my breath. I saw intention leave me like steam. The lane surrendered its last pretense at asphalt and became two dark threads through grass. Then even the threads surrendered, and we rolled onto bare earth that didn't bother to be level. Ahead lay a clearing large enough to hold a carnival and empty enough to embarrass prayer. The grass lay combed in one direction, as if a wide body had passed over it slowly. With thought, he tapped the back of my seat. The touch was careful and exact, not an order, not a threat, simply the letter he used in place of language. I braked. The car reached stillness, and then a second stillness. The one that comes when the air decides to withhold its ordinary drift. He opened his door, stepped out, and stood at the center of that field as if the land were an address, and he had arrived early. I set my hazards, and then remembered there was no one to warn. The dashboard glow washed my hands in a hospital light. He turned his face upward. In the absence of stars, the sky showed me its blank underside. The men I've carried over the years have often needed to speak to the air, needed to confess or bargain or brag. He needed none of that. He needed something larger. And he had brought his own container. The suitcase dangled from his arm when he swung it forward and opened it to the night. The dark around us leaned in to look at the darker inside. For a breath, I saw a depth that made my stomach count the floors it might fall. I thought I heard the notion of a voice, not sound, just the image of how speech might look before sound is born. He bowed his head as if receiving instruction from a height my neck refused to attempt. After a time, the lid closed by kings. He faced me again. His mouth found the curve of civility, and he told me, "Thank you." The syllables arrived whole and undecorated, a receipt rather than gratitude. He took 3 steps backward into the field and dissolved, not behind anything or into anything. He simply liked distance better than proximity and chose it. The grass did not sway where he passed. The night left no record. I remained where I was because moving would have forced me to pick a reason. I considered the logic of leaving the car, pursuing him across the plain, stating things people in stories state when they want to sound brave. Then I considered the other logic, that I had been hired to transport, and the job was complete. And the remainder of the evening belonged to whatever version of me could still drive a straight line. I turned the key out of habit. The engine answered like a friend who isn't happy, but will help anyway. My hands found the wheel where I had left it. The world's simplest instrument, the circle that says turn and be changed. The way back should have been the way back. That is not what the road believed. I retraced the ruts to nothing, the nothing to threads, the threads to a margin of pavement, pretending not to be ashamed. When I reached the first intersection, it had altered its geometry the way a dream quietly edits the furniture after you blink. The crossroads offered 3 directions that looked like 4. I chose the one my body had already taken, because sometimes choosing is just admitting. The darkness softened at the far rim of the landscape, not with color, not with promise, just the suggestion that the clouds had tired of carrying every secret. I checked my phone out of reflex, the way you check a pulse you don't expect to feel, and found bars strong enough to climb. Battery full, signal clean, messages arranged themselves as if I hadn't ignored them. The app displayed a neat green line concluding at a small check mark, completed, a ride summarized without a destination. I entered the city like a person arriving through the wrong door of her own house. Landmarks remembered me just enough to be rude about it. At my apartment, I parked at the curb and sat with the engine off until my heartbeat relearned tempo. There are hours when you can pretend events attached to causes, but morning is not one of them. Quitting should have been dramatic. It wasn't. I opened the driver portal, selected the sliders that change a life, and went still. Selling the car was easier than selling my certainty, but I did both. I learned the apartments available to a person with reduced needs and purchased fewer needs to match them. I found a job that involved windows and daylight and the careful arrangement of numbers. I spoke to my mother on a schedule and told her nothing she could not bless. My friends asked whether I missed the road's freedom. I told them the truth. Freedom depends on believing the map is a promise rather than a dare. And yet the night keeps its investments. Sometimes at the hinge of evening, the city's noise folds away and my rooms feel made of listening. That is when I hear a single instruction living behind everything else I call a thought. The word does not scrape or hiss or plead. It simply occupies. Drive. Not spoken through the air, it's not imagined. A pressure. A finger on a compass that points to a void with a shape like an address.
I have not obeyed. I have not returned to the industrial fringe, the warehouse arteries with the wounded street with the sullen lamp. I know the hunger of curiosity. It wants to dress itself as courage. I keep my keys in a drawer, and the drawer in a room with no car outside. I sleep facing the door as if facing the door could make it answerable.
But when I walk past parked sedans at dusk, their windows sometimes show me my own eyes, and also another set I shouldn't be able to notice. When I wait at a red light in a rideshare, I didn't order. I feel the seat behind me learning my name. When I handle any piece of luggage in a store, my hand expects weight and finds a deeper absence than weight. I set the suitcase down and step back, because stepping back is a note you write to yourself before you can write the rest. People love a moral. I offer none. I offer only the accurate inventory of an evening, a pickup with no address, a passenger with no story, a suitcase with no bottom, a field with no witness, a farewell that meant bookkeeping, a homecoming that preferred exile. The map keeps updating even when you don't, somewhere beyond anyone's destination. A figure waits under a tired light and measures rooms with eyes that prefer interior math. He does not hurry, he does not argue, he neither threatens nor begs. He stands, he accepts the car the world sends and arranges the night around himself the way some men arrange furniture. If the driver asks a question, he points. If the driver insists, he opens the case. If the driver flees, I suspect he arrives anyway. There are warnings I could give, but warnings create the very corridor they forbid. So I will only say what belongs to me and what I am allowed to place on a single, steady shelf. Some passengers are doors, some roads are voids in disguise, and if you hear a word that asks nothing and compels everything, do not mistake it for instruction. It may be the sound of your map finding a way to fold. I no longer ferry strangers, and still the night knows my address. That is the problem with becoming a person the dark recognizes, even when you switch names and cities and habits. You remain a shape the evening likes. If I ever lift a lid again, and the inside offers back more absence than room, I will close it and set it down without ceremony. I will step away with the patience of a stone learning weather. I will practice the only kind of arrival I still trust, the one that returns me to a door I can lock.
And if, on some ordinary weekday, a car slows at the curb and a tall man in a dark suit looks up with pale eyes, and the street lamp above him fails to learn steadiness, and my hand finds keys I swore I no longer owned, perhaps you will see me drive past. Perhaps you will believe I am simply late for something. Perhaps you will think the world is regular again because a sedan carried a body from one neighborhood to another. You will be almost right,
but I will not be returning by the route you would choose for me. The road remembers the shape of my tires, and the night remembers what it loaned us both. So if you pray, do not ask that I forget. Ask only that I keep choosing doors that open to rooms. Ask only that the crossroads remember mercy. Ask only that the men who wait with tidy luggage learn to love walking. And if the app ever shows you a nameless request blooming at the edge of the grid, if you see no destination and all the arrows kind enough to be blank, close your hand around your patience and let the request pass you by. There are jobs that pay in stories you cannot spend. There are fares that require more than money. And there is always, always, a night that wants you to drive. Story number 3, I didn't answer the last call. I saved it. It sits in my phone like a pressed leaf. Color drained, shape intact, a map made of absence. Every road I take at night folds toward the same horizon, as if the sky has decided I'm a needle and it is a magnet. People tell me to let go. But the thing about letting go is that you have to be holding something living first. If you hear your name from a number that shouldn't exist, don't speak. Roads feed on acknowledgements. I tell this the way the highway tells a story. Long, flat, with exits that promise coffee and answers, but deliver neither. Shimey was a weather system in human form. Fast-moving, insistent, a pressure drop that made every plan feel possible. I used to love that about her. I used to hate it too. On the last ordinary night, my phone lit the room like a pale buoy. And somewhere a choice quietly rearranged itself into a fate. I had work due. I had a neat list and a timer. Jaime had momentum. She always did. She'd knock on my door without warning, say something reckless like, "Pick a cardinal direction," and mean it. I could live inside that kind of certainty for a few hours. The way you live inside a song you don't know the words to but sing anyway. People like me need people like her. That's the lie and the truth at once. When she stopped answering, I let the empty minutes stack like loose bills, useless in the wrong currency. There are thresholds you don't notice until you've crossed them. A phone that doesn't ring back. A porch light that goes off at the wrong time. A gut feeling that never learned to speak in complete sentences. I drove to the gas station where her last trace had been logged by a tower and a ledger that didn't care what it was counting, and the attendant recognized her description without effort. And his eyes did this small calculation people do when they're deciding whether to tell you the thing you're asking for or the thing you need. She waited outside, he said. She paced. A car pulled up. She hesitated, then got in. He had nothing more and everything less. The security footage was a watercolor of pixels, the smear of headlights, the suggestion of a profile, the tint of windows that made the car look like an apology. I watched my friend grow small and then not be there. It's strange how quickly absence establishes itself. It's like a room rearranged while you blink. I drove the same route because I thought routes had memory, because I believed asphalt could be persuaded by devotion. The first miles were ordinary, a billboard selling a version of happiness that needs monthly payments, a diner that believes in breakfast as a political platform. Then the shoulder line thickened, as if someone had traced it twice. My GPS hiccuped and then decided to show me an ocean where fields should be. I turned the device off and counted mile markers the way a child counts heartbeats. Fast, sure, certain it matters. When marker 217 appeared twice in a row, I told myself I'd misread it. When it appeared a third time, I didn't tell myself anything at all. Night driving is a conversation with a boundary. You only see what your headlights approve. I passed a girl by the guardrail, hair lit from behind, thumb angled toward a destination I couldn't see. I slowed, and in the mirror she was already gone, as if she'd only existed in the exact geometry of my passing. I told myself she wasn't real. This is how a person starts speaking gently to a lie, because the lie is the only thing staying. At a truck stop with a mural of a rising sun that looked tired of its own job, I found a corkboard full of losts, dogs, keys, a ring, a kid's drawing of a red car with the caption, "If you see this, tell my mum." I pinned nothing and took nothing. A driver in a booth said, without looking at me, "Don't take the shortcut." He didn't know me. He didn't know what I'd ask. He didn't have to. There's a kind of knowledge that hangs in truck stop air, like the smell of fryer oil. Pervasive, unnoticed until you can't scrub it out. He told me about a stretch of road that isn't on maps and doesn't care about laws older than thunder or younger than paint. He didn't call it anything. He didn't have to. My body knew the name before my mouth did. Mile Zero, where time is a circle and the needle never quite reaches the pin. I thanked him, which is to say, I acknowledged the exchange of a burden. Then I went back to the car because I have never once obeyed the kind of advice that considers mercy a strategy. The highway narrowed in a way that made width feel like a belief system. The trees drew together like conspirators. My radio offered only silence between stations, and silence is louder when you know what should be filling it. I thought of Jaime, the ferocious way she pursed her lips when she was impatient, the way she treated a state line like a shrugged shoulder. I said her name into the cabin, not out loud, but in a way that made the car understand we were going to keep driving until we reached the place where the map goes white. If you try to remember your first wrong turn, you'll find that memory is a bad archivist. Keeps the wrong things in the wrong boxes, and I don't know when the stars shifted from reference points to spectators. I only know that the road widened without getting bigger, like a corridor that keeps the same walls but moves them farther away. Every landmark became a rumor. You learn things at night you cannot keep in daylight. You learn, for example, that you can't negotiate with distance, that you learn that fear has breath and discipline, that it can jog alongside the car and keep pace without ever needing to rest. I kept driving because stopping would require a reason, and every reason I had kept dissolving like fog under high beams. Somewhere beneath the engine's steady hum, my mind began to sort through a deck of possibilities. Accident, abduction, flight, choice. There's a last card in every deck. Mine was the idea that Jamie had found a door and walked through it, because doors are exactly what she distrusted. She would test a door precisely because it said, "Do not enter." I found forums that read like ghost towns with Wi-Fi and stories nested inside stories, riders who never arrived, drivers who swore they'd been turning left for hours without ever encountering a curve, people who set their odometer to 0 and discovered it had only one digit. I catalogued them the way a botanist catalogues invasive species. Pattern recognition became a choreography I rehearsed in parking lots, my breath making shapes on the glass. The pattern said, a meeting at the edge of town, a car that wasn't supposed to be there, a set of messages that start reasonable and end like fragments of a broken bottle, sharp, reflecting only what's nearby. I stopped answering calls I didn't initiate. I slept with my shoes on. Friends said I was becoming an instrument tuned only to one note. They were right. The melody of my life had reduced to a drone. And drones can either be meditative or maddening. This one demanded travel. It asked for tolls in minutes and miles. It promised change and delivered recurrence on a 2-lane that reeked of tar and old summer. I crossed a bridge with no river under it. The guardrails ended in mid-air, as if whoever built it lost conviction at the last moment. On the far side, a green sign welcomed me to a town that did not exist anywhere except on that sign. I pulled into a market where fruit sat under warm light, looking more like decoration than food. A woman behind the counter asked if I wanted maps, as if maps were candy or cigarettes. "They're old," she said, "but old paper remembers deep." She slid a stack toward me, and every sheet had a small circle in pencil in the same place, as if each map had been brought, one by one, to a particular point and tapped there like a knuckle on a locked door. The pencil mark sat just beyond the last printed mile marker, as if whoever drew it knew the press would not acknowledge certain truths. I traced it with my finger and felt the paper thin under my skin, a membrane instead of a barrier. "People come here for this," the woman said. "They think it's a place. It isn't." She paused, not for effect, but for accuracy. "It's a transaction." I drove back out with the maps folded into my passenger seat, like a companion who refuses to comment. The road accepted me the way water accepts a thrown stone, completely. Then, with consequences, the trees grew older without changing, if that makes sense. Their trunks had that look of things that have seen fires and made terms with them. My odometer ticked, and then forgot what it had just done. The sky lowered enough to smell. It smelled like cold metal and the first page of a library book. At some hour that wasn't on clocks, my phone made a sound I didn't recognize because I'd never heard it before, and because recognition is often nostalgia, disguised as knowledge. A new photo had arrived from a contact that used to be a person and was now a wilderness for me. I opened it because of course I did. The windshield in the photo reflected my face. Same jaw, same tired eyes, but the glass held me at an angle my car couldn't produce. In the reflection, a road ran straight into a horizon that looked manufactured. Behind me, where a back seat should be ordinary, a shape had decided to be the suggestion of a person and nothing more. I should have thrown the phone away. I should have driven to a church or a river or a police station with their polite lamps. I didn't. The temptation to be the kind of protagonist who makes correct decisions arrived late and left early. Instead, I took the next exit and found myself back on the same stretch, as if the exit had been a loop disguised as a choice. I laughed, the dry kind that comes from a throat that has stopped believing in wet, and kept driving because there wasn't anything else. Not really. The message that followed said only, "I'm here." Not a voice I could replay, not a detail I could hand to an official and expect paperwork to sprout from it. Just that. Presence without coordinates. The market woman's sentence completed itself in my head. It's a transaction. Something had been bought with something else, and I had already paid a deposit by refusing to end the search. Here is what I know now. There is a road that behaves like a story told by a mirror. It gives you back what you bring, except in reverse and slightly colder. It asks for the part of you that believes in outcomes, offers, in exchange, a version of patience so pure it becomes a prison. I entered a segment so straight it felt like a dare. The trees retreated. The lines on the asphalt went from painted to engraved. Far ahead, the horizon whitened. A seam where the world had been stitched and the thread had pulled tight. The steering wheel grew light in my hands. Not the way a car lifts at speed, but the way a decision leaves your body once you've made it. The maps in the passenger seat shivered. Paper does that when it begins to understand its own limitations. I should tell you that I turned around. I should tell you that I was brave in the ordinary way, that I chose life and light and other L words. Instead, I'll tell you the truth. I slowed. I let the car glide. The edge of the horizon brim rose like a ledge, and the white ahead became less light and more absence of color. There wasn't a door. There wasn't a gate. There was simply a continuation so perfect it became erasure. A figure stood ahead at the margin where pavement pretends to end. I knew the profile before I knew the person. Some knowledge is bottom up. It starts in the bones and informs the brain like an envoy. Jaime. She didn't wave. She didn't flag. She existed the way a memory exists, undeniable, uncooperative. If I had stopped, I don't know what would have happened if I had passed. I don't know either, so I did the thing that keeps you from falling out of a story. I spoke her name inside my mouth and let the car roll to a halt with the gentleness you reserve for glass and ghosts. She got in. The door closed with the sound of a decision. We didn't touch. We looked at the road, both of us, as if looking at each other might break whatever tentative treaty had formed in the air between us. Her hair smelled like late nights at the shore when the tide is indecisive. I wanted to ask the questions that have stalked me since. Where did you go? Why did you leave? How did you find the place that isn't a place? Instead, I asked the only question that made sense with both of us looking forward. How far? Almost, she said. A single word that behaves like a sentence? A verdict? A religion? I pressed the accelerator and the car obeyed like obedience had been redesigned. Here is the part where you expect the rules to snap. Maybe the light breaks. Maybe a city appears. Maybe the radio finds a station playing a song that knows your name. None of that. The road continued. Jaime's hand lay flat on her knee. Mine tightened on the wheel until the bosses of tendons rose like ropes. She didn't meet my eyes. She didn't need to. She was the message and the messenger. Don't bring anyone else, I said to her. Not a plea so much as a boundary I wished were a wall. She didn't nod. She didn't argue. The absence of response felt like agreement, because I wanted it to. A mile marker appeared, without a number, as if numbers were suddenly proprietary. Then another blank plaque, then another. The car's clock held the same digits, like an expression that has decided to stay. You don't notice how much you rely on change until it refuses you. The horizon sharpened. We approached the place where the sky and road make a pact. At the exact second before contact, the world did a quiet, decisive thing. It turned. Not left or right, not up or down. It rotated on an axis I had not authorized, and the straight line became a curve that looked straight because that's how perception pays its taxes. We were still moving. We had not arrived. Arrival, it turns out, is a souvenir. You purchase it with endings. We had none. Jaime spoke again, and this time the words were a bridge I recognized because I'd built one like it in my mind. You don't leave, T, she said. You pass it on. I exhaled, not relief, not surrender, but something shaped like a decision's shadow. The transaction, the market woman had been right. The cost is continuity. The receipt is responsibility. I pulled to the shoulder where the gravel looks like failed stars. I turned to her. She was both older and exactly the same. And grief did that optical trick it does where it splits time into layered transparencies. I won't, I said. I won't hand this to anyone. She looked at me then, and there was care in it. The kind that doesn't need softness. That isn't the offer, she said. That's the trap. Out beyond the guardrail, a figure stood, thumb out, eyes steady, patient as weather. The world had set the table and laid one place. I understood the rules, which is different than agreeing to them. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the shoulder. The figure receded in the mirror and then wasn't there. Jaime's seat was empty. The air in the car had a shape where she had been. The way a lake remembers a boat for a moment after it leaves. I kept the wheel straight because I was afraid of what a turn might do. Back in town, sunrise arrived like a verdict. No one appealed. People went to work. I drank coffee that tasted like the idea of energy. I tried to say the events out loud and discovered my voice had been rewired for night frequencies. This is not a confession. It is a field report from a place that registers on no instrument and touches all of them. I still get messages. They don't name me, but they reach me. Photos with angles that don't exist in ordinary physics. Roads that look exactly like the road I'm on. A hint of a face in glass that behaves like water. I keep them. I don't reply. I drive less now, then more, then not at all, then through the long hours as if the world could be persuaded by repetition. On some nights, the city falls away and the only fact is a white line and a promise that refuses to promote itself into certainty. If you must travel alone after dark, carry a map with pencil marks from someone you trust. Refuse shortcuts. Accept that there are journeys you don't complete. Only continue. And if a photo arrives of you in a place you haven't yet been, don't panic. Panicking is just faith in chaos. Instead, fold the image, slide it into the glove box, and keep a steady speed. The road respects steadiness the way the sea respects a captain who knows how to count to 10. I didn't rescue her. I didn't replace her. I learned the geometry, a loop disguised as a line, an invitation dressed as help. When people ask, I say, she is traveling. It's not a lie. It's just not the right verb for humans, for roads. Though it is perfect. There's a point where direction stops meaning what you think. Driven there and back and there again, Dudati. I've memorized the mile where dawn, when it comes, looks like a concession and not a gift. And when my phone wakes at the hour with no name, I let it. I listen. I archive. I refuse to perform the small ceremony that would make me the next link in the chain. This is how I love her now, not by following, not by forgetting, but by refusing to hand the key to a door that should never have been built. If you catch your own reflection in the windshield and someone is sitting behind you in the glass, but not in the car, stay calm, don't brake, don't speed, hold the center. Let the horizon come to you and pass by like a traveler who doesn't ask for directions because the destination isn't the point. And if a voice, a memory, tells you it's your turn, remember this: turns are optional on a straight road. Keep driving, keep your word. Some roads want to own you, this one wants to be you. Deny it the satisfaction.
That's my testimony. Not a cure, not an ending, a lane choice. I take the long one, the honest one, the one that heads for mile zero and never arrives. If you see me out there, don't stop. If you see her, don't either. The kindest thing we can do for each other, sometimes, is let the distance be distance. The wheel is steady in my hands. The horizon doesn't blink. Night keeps its appointments. I keep mine.
Story number 4. I used to believe kindness was a currency that never ran dry. I used to believe a raised thumb on the shoulder of a road was just a question, not a test. I used to believe a storm made places lonelier, not people. I used to believe the route home was a line, not a snare waiting for the soft of heart. I used to believe that if I gave enough, the night would give me back. I grew up in a house where generosity wasn't a rule, it was air. We doubled recipes without measuring and left one pan at a neighbor's door just because. We kept towels in the trunk for dogs we hadn't met yet. Adults used 3 words for me: reckless, naive, foolish, and I wore them like merit badges. I thought the world balanced its books. If I spent kindness, kindness would return. The evening it unbalanced. Rain made the city streets shine like a map of veins. I locked the bookstore behind me and stepped into water that kept choosing gravity over sense. The main road home was a thin silver ribbon, and I followed it because routine is an anesthetic. The highway was empty, the traffic lights throwing their colors into flooded intersections until each red and green felt ceremonial. A true crime podcast murmured names and dates. I told it out loud that my name would never be one of them and turned the volume lower. Then my headlights found her. The color hit first. Yellow, wrong and electric against the drowned backdrop. Then the shape, a young woman at the shoulder, hair plastered to her cheeks, a backpack locked to her chest. Her thumb was out. The old reflex in me stood up and nodded. I braked. I cracked the window and asked if she was hurt. She shook her head. All angles. Just to the next town, she said. My phone died. She slid in with careful gratitude. Water pooling at the mat. Riley, she offered. I gave my name back and the car filled with our breath, fogging the glass. She warmed her hands on the vents and said thank you twice more. The syllables tasting like a scraped knee. I tried for easy questions. Family, an aunt in the next town, work, an interview that needed luck. When I asked where exactly to drop her, she watched the side mirror instead of me and said something that wasn't an address. The rain deepened until the world was narrowed to 2 tunnels of light.
Can we take the old road? She asked. Through the woods. It's faster.
Faster doesn't always mean safer. I knew the old road. Dense trees pressed to the asphalt. barely enough for 2 cars to pass if one of them held its breath. It had a reputation for night that stuck to it like sap. My mother's phrase is, "Don't do it. You don't owe anyone. Safety first." Arrived right on schedule. They were the kind of advice that always sounds like it's scolding you for being human. She watched my hands on the wheel. I turned. The trees leaned in, needles knitting the ceiling overhead. The radio gave a small crackle of static and surrendered. Rain braided itself into threads and wrote on the windshield. Riley's phone woke just long enough to buzz. On the screen, a single message. Ready? Her thumbs moved. The glow died.
How far? I asked her. Almost there. She pointed. There's a clearing. Turn in.
I did. She unbuckled. Fingers quick. My aunt's house is down that path. She held my eyes as if she were memorizing something difficult. You're a good person. The second sentence started and broke. She stepped out before it finished. In the headlights. Her yellow raincoat was a flare in a forest that wanted to swallow color. Then the door shut, and the color went with it. I should have left. Instead, I took a breath that didn't help and reached for my phone to check the time. A tap at my window. Not a knock, not a plea. A man gestured down, palm open, and I mistook courtesy for safety. I cracked the door. He pulled it wide. Another figure stood behind him, taller, a hood masking his face. Fingers closed on my wrist and my name emptied out of my mouth. The ground became mud that didn't care about my shoes. They led me to the clearing. Riley stood there, a streak of yellow, her face striped with water and something harder. "I didn't want to," she said, voice thin. "They said they'd hurt me." Her eyes didn't hold mine. The men moved through me with warehouse efficiency, wallet, keys, phone, and when one of them brought my phone down on a stone, the pieces flew like dull teeth. Rope burned my wrists, fabric covered my eyes, and the world reduced to breath, wet leaves, and the number of heartbeats I could count without losing track. People say to run. People say to shout. The truth is smaller, you count, with the blindfold tugging at my hair. I counted long numbers to keep myself contained. 30, 50, 80. The woods carry sound the way old houses carry drafts. Footsteps went, came back, went again. I kept counting until the only thing left in my mouth was math. I worked the knot at my wrists against the corner of my belt. I have small wrists. Strangers have called it delicate. Tonight, it was leverage. The cloth over my eyes loosened. The dark beyond it wasn't better, only honest. Tall trunks rose like columns in an empty cathedral. Rain threaded down and landed on my cheek with the weight of coins when silence arrived. It didn't announce itself, it just was. I got my knees under me and stood. Back at the road, there was no car. The strip of wet where it had rested was already becoming ordinary pavement. I picked a direction because picking is what keeps you alive. I walked with my arms out like a person finding furniture in a house they just moved into. I spoke to myself because speech anchors a body. I recited the alphabet of the bookstore, the titles I had shelved that afternoon, the authors I always misspelled. I recited recipes. I recited the street names from childhood. You make lists when you don't want to fall apart. A farmhouse gave me a square of light when I went to it, knocked, and prepared to barter any truth for a towel. The woman who opened the door didn't make me bargain. She wrapped the towel around my shoulders and put a mug in my hands and said the sentences that build a temporary shelter. Sit here. Breathe. I already called. The deputy came with a notebook and eyes that landed beside my face as often as on it when he asked when I stopped, what they took, whether I had seen plates or scars or anything with a name. I tried to hand him a sequence that would become a solution, I had impressions instead. Days pulled themselves into weeks, and paperwork put labels on things I didn't have language for. Robbery, assault. They found my car in a ditch, light, yet emptied, like a mouth picked clean. No wallet, no keys, no phone. What they did find was worse. A voicemail sent from my number to my number. So a girl's voice said, "Thank you for your kindness. I'm sorry. Riley." The line ended with an absence bigger than any word that could have come next. "It's not your fault," people said. "You're lucky to be alive," people said. I built a face for these sentences and wore it until it chafed. I stopped picking up hitchhikers. I kept the locks down even in daylight. Kept the windows closed as if air itself were suspect. The radio stayed silent. I didn't want narration. At night, working the late shift at the bookstore, I sometimes glimpsed a girl on the shoulder in the smear of rain where the street widens to memory. And my hands tightened on the wheel. Friends brought bread and advice. Trauma eats routine, they said. Give it structure. So I ran the same block until the sidewalk felt hand-sanded. I cleaned the kitchen like a ritual, stacked plates like a promise. I rearranged the shelves by color, then by alphabet, then by how each book had saved me. This is how you make a country out of small governments, one rule at a time. Still, the woods traveled with me. In a bank line, I could feel twine at my wrists, while in the cereal aisle I tasted rain. I told a therapist, and she said the body keeps every memo. I told her the sentence I couldn't stop hearing, "You're a good person," and she said, "Praise can be bait. Tell the story as she said, "and end it where you choose, not where it ended you." I didn't know how, so I practiced. One evening I turned onto the old highway and took the exit that used to be a choice and now was a measure. Well, I wasn't brave. I was doing math. The world was going to charge interest on my generosity. I wanted to see the rate. The same notch in the trees opened the same path. I left the engine running and stepped into the quiet hum that lives between pine trunks. The briars had grown, but the shapes matched my memory. I found the clearing by feel. The rock that had broken my phone lay in place as if waiting for a second assignment. I sat on it and let the silence press around me until it turned into a room. "Riley," I said. "Riley." And I said it again to keep the name from splitting. When she appeared, I thought I had summoned a ghost. Then she shifted her weight and I saw the human details. Raw knuckles, chapped lip, the way her left shoe was tied in a knot because the lace was frayed. She kept a distance, as if proximity were a fuse. The yellow raincoat looked wrong in the green, a warning label without instructions. "I came to tell you something," she said. "I'm the one who asked you to pull over. I knew what it meant. I thought it would buy me time." She looked past my shoulder at where the headlights of some other car would stripe the trunks. "It bought me a mile and cost you more than that."
"Come with me," I said. "Now, we can go."
She shook her head. "They know me. They know you now, too. If I leave with you and they see, they will collect more. A name, a house, a mother." She took a step back, like a person giving room to a ledge. "I wanted to see your face while I still had the choice, sir." I patted my pockets as if I could hand her an answer. Lip balm, a receipt, lint. "I don't have a plan," I said. "I don't even have a map."
"You have something," she said. "You heard me say I'm sorry. And you didn't throw it back." She looked at the path, then up. "If you ever see someone like me again, don't stop the same way. Give them a ride another way, one that doesn't make a stage for men waiting behind trees." I thought of rides that don't involve doors opening on dark shoulders, prepaid taxis, hot food left with a clerk who sees more than most, numbers you can text that deliver help without delivering yourself. I nodded, and it felt like signing something binding. She stepped back once more, and the yellow became a smaller square. "If I make it farther," she said, "I'll send a sign that doesn't ask anything of you." Then she was gone. Not a disappearance, but a learned skill. I walked out with a sentence that needed time to harden.
mercy is not the same as exposure. It betrayed who I had been, a person who trusted that a lit cabin would appear the moment you needed it. But it saved who I could still be. I told the deputy about the message, ready, and the meeting in the woods. I handed over times and places that might line up with patterns. I told my therapist I would learn to spend kindness like a budget, not a flood. In the months that followed, I stocked the glove box with small cards to a local diner, a list of shelters in the next town, a number for a taxi dispatcher who answers after midnight. I practiced saying, I can't give you a ride, but I can pay for one. The way you practice a new language. It felt awkward until it didn't. The locks stayed down. The windows stayed up, but kindness kept moving, redirected like water around stone. At intersections I still saw her, a flare of yellow, a thumb offered to the rain, a face lifting into my headlights. Drove on, stomach tight, hands steady. It didn't feel cold, it felt careful. Months later, a text arrived from an unlisted number. Just one word. Ready? I powered the phone off. Then on, then off. A ritual without theology. The deputy said numbers like that bloom from cracks, impossible to trace. The therapist said I didn't owe attention to every door that gets knocked. I copied the word onto a piece of paper and burned it carefully over the sink, as if the ash would weigh less than the thought. On a Thursday that looked like any other, rain showed up with paperwork, and I left the store with a hood I should have replaced years ago. The highway would have been faster, but speed had never been the point. Neighborhood streets offered porches and somebody's dog and kids' chalk drawings dissolving into bright puddles. At one corner, a young woman stood with a backpack and hair plastered to her face. I felt the old instinct rise and press against my ribs. I drove to the gas station instead. 2 hot sandwiches, a sticky note with my name and the number of the taxi company. I asked the clerk to call if anyone needed a ride and to put it on my tab. I sat in the car with the radio silent until my breath synced with itself. It felt like choosing a door with a lock on both sides and handing the key through the slot instead of opening it. And that night, I dreamed a road through a forest where every trunk was a lamp, where nowhere existed for a man to stand at your window and reshape your kindness into his profit. I woke with someone else's name in my mouth and said my own instead. Then I wrote a letter I won't mail. Riley, if kindness is a currency, I am learning to spend it on what multiplies, the porch light that's already on, the ride called in your name, the system that lifts more than one person at a time, the part of me that wants to stop still looks for you in rain, the part of me that wants to live keeps the wheels moving, and both parts say your name. Weeks later, an envelope without a return address came to the bookstore. Inside, a postcard of a coastline that has the nerve to keep being beautiful. On the back, a sentence without signature. You're a good person. I held the words in my mouth like a coin I had to evaluate. Not counterfeit, not exactly, not legal tender either. A reminder that praise can be a lure or a lantern, depending on where you set it. Years from now, I will tell this story in a kitchen that remembers to switch the lights on at dusk, with a dog who knows the difference between a knock at the front door and the ice maker, with a friend who doesn't flinch when my voice goes thin. I will say there was a night when a girl in a yellow raincoat taught me how to aim the beam I carry. I will say the sentence that keeps arriving on the edge of memory. Thank you for your kindness. I'm sorry, and I will mean both. When I drive past the mile marker where the woods once tried to balance their book with my life, I look down for one beat, and then I look up. Headlights tunnel forward the way a needle makes room for thread. I spend my kindness like a measured flame. I warm what I can. I do not let the fire go out. Story number 5, I picked up a stranger because silence had started to sound like a verdict. He held a cardboard sign that didn't name a town, only anywhere, and it felt uncomfortably close to my address. His eyes were pale enough to make the darkness inside the car look honest. The first sentence he wrote about me came true before dawn. The last one is still working on me. By the time I understood the crossroads, I had already turned the only way that kept the road going. I was out of the city and aimed at nothing in particular when I met him. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier. I kept the window cracked to let the heat slip past my cheekbones and carried on west. Not because I wanted what waited there, but because the opposite direction had become unlivable. The dashboard clock didn't matter anymore. I drove by the smell of rain in the distance and the glitter of insects colliding with the windshield like stray constellations trying to redraw themselves. He appeared in the beams the way a truth appears, suddenly, completely, as if it had been there forever, just outside the radius of my attention. Tall, a coat much too heavy for the season, hat brim turned down like he was listening to the road itself. I rolled to the shoulder and let the idling engine stitch a small circle of certainty around us. "Where to?" I asked. He tipped the sign a little, as if to remind me, stared at the single word, the audacity of it. He leaned in, and the smell of old paper and the faint mineral trace of drier air rode in with him. I unlocked the door without quite deciding to. He folded himself into the seat with an economy that suggested practice, not comfort. I pulled back onto the highway. And for a minute we were two strangers, sharing a moving line through darkness. Then he spoke, not to introduce himself, but to measure me. "I listen to what the road keeps under its breath," he said. "It talks in lines and breaks in the paint. Tonight it's been talking for hours." I tried to laugh, but the road didn't approve, and the sound fell flat. He turned his face to the window. Reflective glass turning his profile into a sketch you make with a single line and never lift the pen. I asked where he'd been and where he was going. He let the questions pass, like mile markers, acknowledged but not answered. He took out a notebook that had already survived rain, sun, and hands that pressed too hard. He wrote fast. The way you write, when the words are arriving from somewhere you're afraid will change its mind. I didn't mean to read over his shoulder, but the script was neat and drew the eye like a lane arrow. He didn't hide it. He didn't perform either. He just wrote. And every few lines the pencil would pause and he'd study me as if he was checking the sky for confirmation. I told myself it was the heat making my head light. I told myself 100 things I didn't believe. He spoke again, and the timbre of his voice felt like the middle distance of a long road, close, far, both. "I go where I'm needed," he said at one point. Staring out the window, he lifted the page and touched a finger to a sentence. "Some people hear me, others only hear their engines." "What do you hear in my engine?" I asked. He turned his head, and the pale weight of his eyes settled at the base of my skull. "Tonight it says you need to listen." The words didn't sound like advice. They sounded like an address finally spoken aloud. He wrote again. I kept driving. The highway narrowed into a two-lane strip that rose and fell with the land's old breath. The trees along the shoulders came closer, as if they were curious. When he tore a page free and handed it to me, I didn't look right away. The act of accepting it felt like agreeing to something binding. I put it face down on my thigh and pretended to watch for deer. He chuckled, no humor, only permission, and said, "Predictions good." He said, "Things that haven't happened yet." The words arrived out of order, like he'd borrowed them from a conversation we were about to have. I flipped the sheet and read, "You will see the sign at the crossroads. When you do, choose carefully. Not every path leads home." The handwriting steadied the statement with elegance, like it had been copied over many times, until the pen and the hand stopped arguing. I felt the old reluctance rise in me, the habit of grinning through what I didn't understand. I was good at taking the easy turn whenever the hard one asked for an answer. He angled his face toward me. "What are you running from?" he asked. "Conversational as weather." Aren't we all? I said. He nodded as if we had confirmed a theorem. That's why the road bothers to talk at all. I let the silence spool out between us. In my chest felt like a motel room after checkout. Tidy, empty, vaguely guilty. The longer we drove, the more the air in the cabin thickened, not with heat now, but with consequence. Somewhere ahead, a choice was waiting on its stool, tapping one foot against the floor. Branches knitted close over the lane. The world became a tunnel with a roof made of bone. I downshifted to give myself the illusion of control. He closed the notebook and capped his pencil. The sign stood where the shadows agreed to part. Its post slanted. The paint wore its years without apology. By the time my beams touched it, I knew what it would say. Turn back while you can. Another sign had been hammered to the base once and torn away, leaving a scar like an erased instruction. One road angled left, smooth and assured. The highway's cousin, the other met us hesitantly. A narrow track that let the wild reclaim it in places. I slowed to a stop, center line under my feet, like a seam you might pull to see if the garment comes apart. My hands dampened the wheel. I didn't want to ask him, but I wanted to hear him refuse. Which way? I asked anyway. He shrugged with a gentleness that hurt. I don't tell people where to go. I hold the light steady so they can see what they're doing. I looked left. I looked right. My chest said one thing. My habits said another. The notebook in his lap said nothing. The future kept its hands in its pockets and waited to see if I'd notice it staring. I turned the easy way. I have been turning that way my entire life. He didn't criticize, Wally. He nodded once. As if he had been present the last dozen times, I had chosen speed over meaning. We moved forward, and the canopy of trees lifted enough to let the sky follow along. The temperature fell by degrees you could feel on the skin. The world thinned out behind the glass. I told myself it was nothing. He made a small note and closed the book, slid the elastic band around it like a belt. I cleared my throat. Who are you? He smiled without warmth or cruelty, the way a sign smiles when you finally read it aloud. I'm just a passenger. You invited me in. The truth of it rubbed my nerves raw.
But there's a kind of courage that looks like unhooking yourself from an outcome. I tried to find it. I failed. I think you should get out, I said. And the sentence felt like pulling a fire alarm behind bulletproof glass.
He nodded, opened the door, and stepped into the thicket beyond the shoulder. The dark accepted him without comment, like a lake taking back a thrown stone. For a second, the car was lighter. The next second, the road was not. The headlights faltered as if they'd been blinking this whole time and decided to rest. I eased off the accelerator. The engine made a grave decision on my behalf and coasted me to a stop. I tried the ignition. Nothing. I lifted my phone. No bars. No anything. The trees had shaped a room around me, and the handle turned one way only. The hour didn't have a number. The night didn't have a face. When the lights appeared behind me, two white eyes framed by distance, I felt the kind of gratitude that empties you out. A car pulled alongside and idled with the patience of a friend who knows you are finally ready to ask for help. The window came down. A woman sat behind it. Kind mouth, steady gaze, hands on 10 and 2 like a lesson.
Are you all right? She asked.
My car died, I said, and my voice surprised me with how young it sounded. My car died. Can you give me a ride? Of course, she said. The lock clicked like a verdict being reversed. And I was in the passenger seat again, and the upholstery firm and new. We moved forward. The lane felt familiar, then very familiar, then wrong in a way that had no opposite. She glanced at me like we had been traveling together for years. You know, she said, and paused as if she needed me to own the moment before she finished. But you can't outrun yourself. No matter how far you drive, you'll find yourself waiting at the next stop. The sentence fitted around my ribs like a glove. I stared at her profile. In the glass of the window, her face held, then slid, then reassembled as someone I almost recognized, then as the man from before, then as nobody at all. She smiled each time with the same clean accuracy. "Some roads never end," she whispered. "Some choices can't be undone." I reached for the handle and found certainty where the latch should be. The door wasn't built to open from here. We kept going. The highway gave way to a geography I couldn't name. Fields without fences, towns made of a single light, stretches of asphalt that briefly remembered being river and tried to bend. In the distance, a billboard promised a service station that never arrived. I saw my reflection in the glass, and it looked like a man rehearsing for a confession.
"You met him," she said. I didn't ask who she meant. "He wrote me into his book," I said.
"He writes everyone into it. The book is as old as the first mile and as new as the exit you keep telling yourself you'll take. What's the price to get out of it? The page tears easy," she said, "but it never leaves the notebook." We passed a marker that read 0 and then another that read 0 again. If time had been there, it was being kind enough not to show itself.
"Why me?" I asked. The pity in my voice was a bruise I didn't know I was carrying. "Because you wanted to go anywhere more than you wanted to go home," she said. And there was no accusation in it, only taxonomy.
The road brought us back to where it had been leading all along. The trees made their same old arch. The sign waited with the patience of something that can afford to be patient. We slowed. We stopped. She turned to me. Her face took on the angles and shadows of the man's face, then unlearned them, then became ordinary again, the hardest thing to be. "This is your stop," she said.
Here I stepped out because stepping out was the next sentence. Gravel under my shoes and air that smelled faintly of rain on hot metal. I stood before the sign and read it again, even though I knew it by heart. The left-hand road looked exactly as easy as it had. The right-hand road looked like a dare from my better self. I thought about the life I had called a life, the job that fed my anxiety and starved the part of me that made anything, the messages from people I loved that I read and didn't answer. The slow, bright attrition of hope. I thought of the night the doctor said my father's heart had had enough of his silence, and how I nodded while my mouth saying it understood while my body signed a different contract. And I thought of the word home and how I had attached it so firmly to a location that I'd forgotten it was also a direction. The prophet stepped from the trees as if continuing the conversation. We had paused rather than ended. He neither smiled nor frowned. He carried the notebook at his side as if it were a simple errand. "You could turn right," he said. It wasn't encouragement, it was inventory.
"What's there?" I asked. "What isn't?" he said, and let the answer carry its weight.
"I should have taken it before."
He tilted his head. "Should his just a left turn in nicer shoes?" I closed my eyes and lined myself up with a version of me that had not yet learned to settle. The night put a hand on my shoulder, not heavy, but definite. When I opened my eyes, the easy road looked like a story I'd already told too many times. The other path looked like work. I set my foot toward the dark track. No trumpet sounded, no sky parted. The trees did not make room. But the moment I crossed from level pavement to the uncertain give of the track, the woman's engine fell away. The prophet's outline thinned, and a vertical quiet opened that wasn't empty. It was available. I walked. The path met me with roots and stones and decisions that didn't announce themselves as such. I wanted a flashlight and settled for the kind of sight you earn by standing still until the dark starts trusting you. Behind me the sign waited, patient as geology. Ahead, the path angled toward a hill that held the shape of a question. The first thing I learned was that every 10 steps, the road asked me to put something down, took off the version of myself that only answered emails, and I unshouldered the apology I'd been wearing since I was 12. I left at the base of a cedar, a habit of exiting conversations early because I suspected I didn't have anything worth saying. Each time I set one down, the way ahead widened by an inch. The prophet didn't follow, but I felt him watching in the way you feel a sentence finish itself in your mouth a second before you say it, and I thought of his words, and knew I had not escaped him. I had only moved into the part of the book with more blank space on the page. At the crest, I found a bench made from a fallen trunk and sat. I expected a vision. I got a view. The left-hand road shone faintly where the moon found it. It looked like a vein. The right-hand path threaded the land without map or metal. My breath came steady, not because I was calm, but because there was finally something to keep pace with besides my fear. Below, a car paused at the sign. The driver leaned out and looked both ways. For a second, I thought I saw my own profile, but it was only the human trick of recognizing yourself in everyone. The car turned left. I didn't judge. I wished them a gentle night. Morning arrived like a negotiation. The first light took its time and asked for patience. The air smelled different, less like heat, more like what heat leaves behind when it stops pretending to be the whole story. I stood, and the bench remembered my shape only briefly before it forgot me, as it should. I walked until my calves burned and the berry thorns had signed my shins in red ink. The path met a stream that had learned to move by listening to stones and altered its voice according to what they asked. I waded, shoes on, because progress sometimes looks like ignoring common sense without arguing with it. On the far bank, the track grew, not into a highway, but into something that understood itself. Hunger made itself known. I broke open a granola bar from the glove compartment I'd thought I'd left behind. Memory is full of strange compartments, and ate without joy or disgust. Only acceptance. Birds stitched sentences between branches. I tried to read them and could not. But the attempt made a space in me where a different kind of knowing could sit down. By midday, the track brought me to a clearing where a building should have been but wasn't. Instead, there was a table with a map engraved into its surface. No legend. No, you are here. Just lines and crossings. I touched the place where two lines met and felt a pulse under my fingers. The pulse matched my heart and then led it by a beat until I let it.
People don't get lost out here, the prophet's voice said. Though the man himself did not appear, they get found by what they kept insisting wasn't there.
I thought the point was to go home, I said to nobody in particular. The point is to have a home to go to. I laughed once. The kind of laugh that doesn't try to distract from anything. When I left the map and walked, the path entered shade. The shade accepted me. Somewhere behind me, the easy road continued to carry people efficiently away from the moments that would have changed them if they had let them. I wished them sufficient weather and a radio that stayed in tune. I don't know when the loop found me again. Maybe loops aren't places you arrive, but patterns that arrive in you. I turned a bend, and the trees arranged themselves into the old arch, and the sign stood in its scarred certainty, and the left road waited with its palm up. The right-hand path began again in the exact way that makes you think you've been wasting your time. A car idled by the post. My car. The door hung open as if I'd just stepped away to stretch my legs. The seats knew me. The steering wheel remembered my hands. I stood between the versions and felt the little panics deploy. What if none of this mattered? What if I made the right turn and still ended up here? Because here is where I always end up. The questions wanted to make me small. The road has an old answer to them. Keep walking anyway. I took one more step toward the right-hand path, then another. The car behind me shivered into the idea of a car, and then into a memory, and then into a line in a notebook, and then into the blank space under that line. The engine of the world turned in its sleep and adjusted the blanket.
I don't know if the prophet smiled. I don't know if the woman raised a hand from the driver's seat in a blessing I didn't deserve. I don't know if the sign grew another ring of age, and I know that the road stretched out before him, endless and empty. Only this time, The him in that sentence didn't scare me. He was only the person I would keep choosing until I learned to choose better.
I walked until the sun set and the air warmed again and the insects wrote their bright mistakes against the dusk. When the path offered me a place to stop, I stopped. When it asked for another choice, I gave it one. When the fear tried to stage a performance, I let it tire itself out. If there was a loop waiting ahead, then it would have to catch me while I was moving. And somewhere behind me, or ahead, or exactly where our lives keep crossing, even when we don't notice. The roadside prophet closed his book, opened it again, and waited for the next passenger to invite him in. Story number 6, I drive at hours when houses go dark and thoughts grow loud. On those back roads, the night is a mirror, and every mile reflects something I don't want to face. I tell myself, I'm only a delivery driver. A name on invoices, a set of hands on a wheel. The lie holds until rain turns the world into memory. And memory turns me into a father who is late again. I used to believe roads always led somewhere. These days, I know some of them circle what you fear and bring it back to your door. I have learned that rescue is a promise you make before you understand its cost. I made it anyway. I am telling you this because the story keeps knocking. It will not stand in the rain forever. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the narrow country road into a slick ribbon of black glass. I remember those words as if a narrator lived inside my skull, describing what my wipers could barely manage. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches clawing at the sky. My headlights stretched a weak tunnel ahead, and the cab smelled like coffee gone flat. I kept thinking of Emma, my daughter, breathing softly in a small bed I failed to see often enough. Somewhere between my guilt and the next turn, the road bent and offered me something I had not asked for. A little figure, still, soaked, unmistakable. She wore a faded pink raincoat. The exact shade I'd searched for the winter Emma begged for color in a grey season. The girl's hair clung to her cheeks, her arms folded across her ribs as if holding herself in place. When I rolled to a stop, I practiced the most ordinary sentence a man can offer a frightened child. I asked if she was all right, and she lifted her face. Her eyes were wide. The kind of wide that usually means seeing too much, too fast. I can drive you somewhere safe, I said. Because safe is a destination when you do not have an address. She gave a name, Liar, as if she had rehearsed only that one thing. She told me to wait, but she never came back, and that's what she said about her mother, each syllable like a step downstairs you cannot see. I unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in slowly, buckled herself without being asked. One fist circling the strap, as if she were the tether. Not the other way around. I talked about Emma. About how 9-year-old worries fold if you spread them on a warm table with soup nearby. Liar listened, half statue, half tide pulled by something I could not hear. When we reached the gas station, light pooled under the awning like a small stage waiting on actors. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the lot into darkness. My phone went bare, the radio filled with static. I turned to tell Liar to hold on and found only fabric and seat foam. The passenger seat was empty. The door still locked. For a second, the world narrowed to the shape of that seat. I ran outside and scanned for small tracks and logic. There was no sign of her, no footprints in the mud, no trace she'd ever been there. A cruiser drifted into the lot in time to watch me losing a calm I pretend to own. The officer took notes with careful neutrality. Cameras later offered only wet pavement and my confusion framed by fluorescent gloom. Days tried to sand the edges off the memory and failed. My porch collected tiny brown smudges I didn't notice until sunrise. Ovals with a suggestion of toes. Emma asked for a different nightlight, then for 2, then for me. She told me about a girl in a coat the color of candy, standing near her window with rain cupped in her hood like coins. I told my wife I would see a doctor. My wife told me to sleep. Sleep told me the same story but louder. I began to read, at first records, then between them. I learned the county keeps two histories, the one with budgets and bridges, and the one with names that never sign their own endings. A girl named Leah lost in the woods during a storm, never found. The article had a photograph taken on a porch too clean for disaster, a child in a pink raincoat. Her gaze not at the lens, but at some other duty. When the county database ended in a shrug, I filled the tank and went looking for the edge where my first mistake had begun. I know you expect what happened next to be sensible. I expected that, too. The line of trees gathered closer as though they had decided to confer. I parked on the gravel shoulder and let the engine settle. He called her name, but only the wind answered. It is strange how a sentence can belong to you even if the pronouns are wrong. I tried again without my voice, saying her name the way you pray, quiet but durable. My feet found a path that felt both old and impatient. Rain threaded through needles and leaf, a concrete rectangle, defeated and moss-soft, revealed itself where a home had once chosen its outline. In the center, a stone the size of a child's certainty.
Leah, beloved daughter, lost but not forgotten.
Something touched my shoulder, light, chilled, small. I didn't whirl. I simply breathed as if the air had been loaned to me conditionally. The rain came harder, each drop a thread tightening a net around the afternoon. I placed a hand flat on the stone. I am late, I said. I am here anyway. Somewhere behind me, a branch let go of rainwater it had been saving. The sound made the clearing feel occupied, and presence is not always visible. Sometimes it is the space you make and the silence that follows. I left flowers I could not keep alive and a story I could. I drove home without the radio. The house felt slightly larger, as if a room had been added while we were out. Emma slept without turning. The porch dried clean. That might have been enough. But the thing about debts is that paying them reveals others. The nightmares stopped after that, but I did not stop noticing pink when it entered a room the way weather does. Sudden, total, with an instruction you cannot hear until you obey. There were nights on that same road when the rain spelled out her outline in a way I could almost read. Sometimes I kept driving, sometimes I slowed to the speed of regret and looked as if looking could hold.
I used to call the lives inside my head imagination. Now I call them traffic. They come when the clock is bad and the route is long, and they insist on right of way until I move aside. On one such night, the dispatcher added a stop that pushed me deeper into the county's paper white veins. My hands did every habitual thing, blinkers, mirror, wipers, but my mind had already lifted one county over where a list of names ended in a blank line. In the middle of that partial attention, I saw a color I can recognize faster than my own reflection.
A pink shape condensed out of rain the way breath condenses on glass. She stood in the exact portion of ditch where the ground hardens under years of runoff. The hood cast a small roof over her face, and in that shade I felt the gravity of second chances. This time, there was no convenience store waiting ahead, no officer ready to explain me to myself. There was just me. A truck idling like a big animal, and the decision I had been rehearsing since I found the stone. At first, Mark thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. That sentence didn't fit me anymore. But it belongs to the story like weather belongs to the sky. The figure stood where wet grass becomes ditch. Chin tucked, back straight, with the resolve of those who are still waiting even when they have waited long enough. I eased onto the shoulder and lowered the window. I did not ask the ordinary questions. I told her this. I remember you. The face that lifted was not a child's portrait pinned to a page. It was a life that had paused in a place and refused to unpause until witnessed. I told her I had found the stone. I told her about the flowers that were not brave but were willing. I told her Emma sleeps now, and the house hears only the refrigerator and the wind through the gutters. She did not answer with sound. She answered with a step forward. The way you move when someone finally says a thing you have been waiting forever to hear. She placed both hands on the door, not to open it, but to feel if it would open. For a second, in the dome light. Her eyes were wide and glassy. Then she looked down at the seatbelt as if it were an old friend. There are promises that bind the one who hears them more tightly than the one who makes them. I said, "You don't have to ride. You can, but you don't have to." She looked past me, down the dark seam of road that had failed us both. When she spoke, it was the smallest sentence, but it filled the cab anyway. "I can't find my mum." The words landed exactly where they had before, but the echo was different. "I know," I said. "You are not lost to me." I did not drive away this time. I turned off the engine and sat with her inside the sound of water finding every surface. We waited long enough to become part of the scenery. When trouble failed to materialize, I told her the rest of what I meant to say the night she vanished from a locked car. "I will keep stopping. You belong to more than one place now. I don't know how to fix that. I know how to show up." Her shoulders changed by half an inch, the architecture of relief. Humanity can be measured that way. We walked to the edge of the trees where the earth smelled like medicine. Grief loosens when it is named and steadied by another pair of hands. I told her about the foundation, the rectangles where rooms had been, how families lay themselves over ground until their shapes print and remain. I told her the name was there and not there. I told her stone is brave in a different way than children. She was quiet, not because she was empty, but because she was listening to something I could not hear. Then she touched my wrist, and we went back to the truck.
"You are remembered." I meant it as a sentence and a map. She nodded with the seriousness of those who carry things for the rest of us. Then she went the way rain goes, everywhere at once, and then not at all. I stood there with my hands open and thought of all the parents for whom a doorbell remains a kind of instrument, and somewhere a horn sounded on a truck that had nothing to do with us, and somewhere a kitchen light turned off. I walked back to the cab and sat, the way you sit in a church after everyone else has left, aware of the air.
He tried to protect Emma, keeping her close, locking every door and window. That used to be the way I described safety. Now it feels like a story I told because I didn't know the better one. Safety became showing Emma how to stand at a window without fear, how to look long enough to recognize whether the night is offering a warning or a request. We practiced names the way some families practice instruments. Softly at first, then with more confidence, Emma learned to say liar the way you say grace. You think hauntings are about houses. I did too. Then I learned a road can remember, and a man can be an address. The deliveries thinned as the season turned, with the extra hours I had promised myself for Emma. We made Saturdays into rituals, pancakes that did not hold their shape, walks that held everything else. Emma asked to see where kindness goes when it leaves home. I told her some places are not for children. She told me some children have no choice. I gave in the way fathers do when they see the seriousness in a child's eyes and recognize it as their own. We drove by daylight to the ruin that rain had been polishing for years. I parked far back and held her hand along the path. The clearing accepted us. The stone did not turn away. Emma read the name without my help. She placed a small plastic pony, the one that had lost its tail years ago but had not lost its position on her windowsill, at the base. Her voice was steady. If she comes by, she will know we were here. Sometimes a child writes a better prayer than you. The nightmares stopped after that. Not just hers. Mine found other work to do. The house learned new sounds, the slap of wet shoes on a mat, the turn of pages late, the quiet of Emma reading to her, stuffed bear, about a girl who finds what was promised. We went back now and then, never at the same time of day, never by any schedule the living could predict. We cleaned what we could, which was not much, and we left what mattered, which was everything we carried in small hands. On a Thursday, when the sky was undecided, I found myself rooted down the old stretch without planning it. The rain returned as if it had only stepped into the store for a minute. Ahead, where the ditch throws up grass and the trees rehearse their closing argument. A figure gathered herself from the weather. I slowed without thinking. I did not stop because I believed I could fix anything. I stopped because this is what you do when you belong to a story and it belongs to you. She stood perfectly still, as if stillness were a kind of language. But Mark never forgot the girl in the pink raincoat. That is an old sentence, and it is still the right one. Memory is a road you drive even when it has no lines painted, even when the map declines to admit it exists. When I go that way now, I grip the wheel, heart heavy, and send the only kind of message that travels as far as it needs to. Not a plea, not a bargain, just a promise. For every mile that goes dark, we will keep a light in a window. For every child who waits, we will arrive with names and patience. For every unanswered question, we will answer with our presence. He still drove that stretch of highway, always watching the roadside, always ready to stop. I still do. If you drive there someday and notice a man pulling onto the shoulder for nothing you can see, give him room. He is keeping company. If you notice a small print on clean concrete after rain, do not wipe it away. It is a signature. Proof that kindness leaves marks where loss insists it cannot. And if more, on a late night of your own, you find the road turned to black glass and a figure standing as rain decides the shape of everything. Open your hands. Some stories ask only that much. Story number 7. The first rule of the road is that it forgets you. The second is that memory never does. I pulled a stranger out of a cone of dirty light, thinking I was rescuing him from the night. By sunrise, I wondered if I'd handed him my life instead. He asked for a game in a voice that sounded harmless, and I accepted before I understood the stakes. And the token was small enough to lose in a pocket, but no debt is ever small. Ask me the last question again, and watch what it costs to answer. I was driving west to get smaller. The map offered a thin line, and I followed it like a thread through a dark needle, trying to pull the knot inside me tight enough to vanish. I'd left my brother's porch with the taste of metal on my tongue, and the echoes of words I shouldn't have said still vibrating in my bones. The car smelled like coffee gone bitter and motel soap. The dashboard glowed a tired constellation. I told myself distance could fix the parts of me that wouldn't listen. The road could wash away anything, regret, anger, even guilt. That had been the comforting lie I fed myself when I needed the hum of tires to drown me out. When the gas gauge slipped toward its left-hand truth, I eased off at a rest area where the lights shook and the vending machines hummed their indifferent lullaby. The bench under the lamp held a figure with a hood up and a backpack folded at his feet like a loyal dog. I should have kept moving. I should have, but I stopped. But he came closer without rushing, as if he'd been rehearsing the distance between us and knew exactly how long it should be. He was younger than me by a handful of ruined summers. Cheekbones a little too sharp, grey eyes that didn't catch the light so much as measure it. He leaned to the window when I cracked it, and the cold brought in the smell of rain that hadn't decided to fall. "Where you headed?" I asked, my voice trying on the friendliness of a stranger who would forget this in an hour. He tipped his chin toward the ribbon of highway like it was a river, and he was the most patient fisherman in the world. "West," he said. "Anywhere you're going." My hand moved to the lock before my better judgment finished its argument. He slid in with a respectful economy of motion, placed his pack on the floor, and buckled up as if the seatbelt were a promise between us. We drove a while inside a tunnel of headlight and fog-smudged trees. The radio offered stiff, late-night opinions. I turned it down until it was only a murmur I could pretend belonged to other cars in other lanes. The stranger let the quiet work on me. His gaze touched my profile and returned to the window like a tide that already knew the shape of my shore. "You ever play anything to stay awake?" he asked finally, voice unhurried, as if he were offering water. "I talk to myself," I said. "I argue with people who aren't here." He smiled at that without showing teeth. "Let's try something simpler." We trade questions, one at a time. No lies allowed. If you lie, you lose. I laughed to put the floor back under my feet and found out the floor had never been there. "How would you know?" He didn't blink. "I'll know." He was so sure. The assurance fit him like a coat. I said okay, because I had said okay to worse.
He didn't warm me up. He didn't need to. "Why are you running?" was his first shot. Without any ceremony, the answer rose in me with the speed of something that had been rehearsing its escape. And I said I'd stolen from my brother when he needed the money most, told myself I'd put it back, didn't. Then got good at not answering my phone when the name on the screen demanded better of me. I told him I'd run because staying would have required an apology I wasn't brave enough to make sober. He took it in like a clerk recording the price of a common item. "Your turn," he said, almost kind. I asked why he was hitching in a place like this at an hour like this. He watched our reflection flatten and stretch along the guardrail. "Looking for someone," he said. "That's someone who owes me." He didn't say me like a person. He said it like a ledger.
The miles unspooled. The highway narrowed until it felt like I was threading a wire. He asked questions that didn't aim for the surface. "What's the worst thing you've ever done?" I told him something easy first. A truth that practiced a smaller shape. I'd left my parents waiting at an airport a lifetime ago because beers with friends had seemed briefly holier than obligation. Then I told him the part that kept me honest. The cab they took lost its good grip on the world. The call came, and I found out what kind of son I had been by the shape of the silence that followed. He turned his head, not to look at me, but to listen better. "Do you regret it?" His voice made the question a room. I stepped into it and didn't touch the walls. I said yes. Every day carries the weight of that one. He nodded like a doctor, hearing a heartbeat that confirms what the stethoscope already suspected. He asked other questions that felt like he was inventorying the architecture of my grief. "If you could erase one moment from your life, what would it be?" The answer came out clean and fast as a snapped thread. That airport night, the cocktail glass ring on the table, the way I laughed when I should have been driving. He took that, tucked it into an imaginary pocket, and offered me my next turn. I asked him what kind of debt he was collecting. He didn't deny the word. "Old," he said, "the kind that survives the people who made it." The fog grew thicker, drew closer, accepted the shape of our car, and gave nothing back. When the road narrowed again and the trees leaned in as if they were trying to overhear us, he sat forward, forearms on his thighs, and said, almost gently, "Let's play a game." I reminded him we were already playing one. He smiled like a patient teacher. "Same rules, babe," he said. "Higher stakes." The next round was not friendly. He asked for the names I didn't speak when I told stories about my life, for the addresses I avoided, for proof I had not made my whole self out of excuses. In return, I asked him questions that failed to stick. His answers were precise in the way a locked box is precise. He described towns without describing the rooms he slept in. He described faces without admitting if he'd learned their names. Somewhere in the asking, my body learned a new kind of tired, one that felt like a draft blowing under a door that had always been there. The yellow lines slid under us like a ribbon being pulled by a magician I didn't trust. when the first beam of a sun we couldn't see started to grey the fog. He offered me a last turn the way a priest offers a candle. "One more," he said, "if you light it, you have to keep carrying it." I asked him for his real name. He smiled at the windshield. "Sam Works," he said, and then he stole back the fire he'd offered. "My last question, sir," he said. And it didn't feel like a question, so much as a door creaking open inside my chest. If you had the chance to start over, but someone else had to stand where you're standing now, would you take it? I gripped the wheel because my hands needed something to deny. The fog deepened as if it were listening. I wanted to tell him it was a trick question and then demonstrate the trick and then applaud myself for catching it. Instead, I said I didn't want anyone to suffer because of me. He nodded like he was bookmarking a page. The lights flickered. The engine coughed into quiet. The dashboard stars went out all at once. And we glided to a stop as if an invisible hand had put us on a shelf. He didn't look surprised. He reached into his pack and brought out a small carved circle of wood. The color of old tea. He placed it in his open palm and turned it until I could read the neat letters burned into one face. Ode. "Take it," he said. I told myself that not taking it would be the moral choice, but it sat there like a lesson I had already failed. I reached. The token wasn't heavy, but it had the density of a story that had been told too many times. Cold washed up my arm like water, remembering the shape of a shoreline it used to touch. The world slid sideways. The fog folded, unfolded, decided I belonged somewhere else. For a second, the car was a hallway of dim rooms. The stranger's face blurred into a handful of grey intentions. My own hands became the hands of someone who had belonged to me and no longer did. The next breath I took belonged to a man standing on damp shoulder gravel with light just beginning to pry open the horizon. The highway was empty. My car was gone. The morning took itself seriously. I checked my pockets like a thief checking a confession and found an old watch my brother had worn in better days. Its crystal unworn, its band not yet broken by the hour I had stolen from him. A note, folded small as a secret, waited beside it. I opened it with care I normally reserve for breaking bad news. Every debt must be paid. Every game has a winner. I walked because there wasn't another instruction. My phone slept the sleep of a dog on a different porch. The screen stayed dark and indifferent, as if it belonged to someone my thumbprint couldn't convince anymore. A car the color of patience slowed, pulled close, and a woman with a face like the better half of a long night leaned over to ask if I needed help. I told her yes, because the word carried less weight than no. She let me in and didn't try to fix the silence between us, at the first town the morning could find. She put me down in front of a diner that had practiced forgiveness between a coffee pot and a cash register. She handed me a few bills like a stranger paying off a kindness someone else owed. "Breakfast helps," she said. "And then you try again." I watched her taillights vanish into the honest part of the day and learned how to breathe like a person whose plans had been taken to a different address. I sat by the window with a plate I didn't want and a watch I did. In the chrome that lined the counter, my face looked like it had been borrowed, and I told myself I would wait for the punchline. And when it didn't arrive, I started making the kind of lists that don't help. Streets I could walk, calls I could try, names I could test on my tongue to see which ones still answered to me. Years aren't hours, but they can vanish just as quietly. I rebuilt my days like a man who had inherited a crooked house and decided to live in it anyway. I returned the money with interest. I told the truth to the person who had been waiting for it and tried not to argue with the silence that followed. My brother did the thing no one prepares you for. He forgave me without dramatics. I took a job that required showing up even when my worst self offered clever excuses. I learned how to cook food you had to watch instead of food you could leave alone. When I saw my parents in the mirror of a window while walking home, I spoke aloud to them without worrying about who might hear, sometimes late, when the night got too honest. I would drive the long way around the edge of town and approach the old highway as if I were tipping a hat to something I owed, and sometimes I saw him. Not the man, exactly, but the shape of him. A figure under a light that didn't have the generosity to stay steady. He never waved, he didn't need to. The invitation has the calm of a letter that has already been stamped, addressed, and placed in a box you walk past every day. One evening, the sky turned the color of a bruise healing, and I realized I was already driving faster than I liked. The watch on my wrist had the good manners to keep time. In the passenger seat lay a folded map I didn't need. The kind you unfold when you want your hands to pretend they still choose. I reached the rest area, whose cracked pavement had practiced loneliness. He stood where I knew he would, wearing a jacket, the green of a memory I didn't trust, and I didn't stop. I told myself I had outgrown that lesson. I told myself that the game had found other players, that my refusal would not change the size of the net the world throws over the guilty. And yet I came back the next night, slower. As if apology had gears, this time I parked. I didn't open the door. I rolled the window down far enough to let a conversation in, but not far enough to invite a trade. "You're early," he said. His face hadn't aged. His eyes never learned the word tired. "But there are rules," I said. He considered that, amused. "There are always rules? Some of them are mine." Something in me that had been waiting a long time decided to sit on the edge of the bed and listen. I told him I knew the last question and that I had been answering it every morning without the ceremony of fog. He didn't deny the pleasure of ritual. "Ask me something I can't answer it," he said. So I did. I asked him if he remembered the first life he traded. His mouth softened just enough to prove he didn't usually allow it. "Memory lives where it's fed," he said. A neat sentence that avoided the hunger in it. I asked him how many tokens there were. He looked past me toward the road as a flock of taillights lifted like red birds and disappeared. "Enough," he said. I asked him who wins when the game is played right. He tilted his head as if a small sound had corrected his posture. Winners are a story we tell debt to make it feel better about its appetite. I wanted to be clever. I wanted to find the hinge in his answers and pry the door off, but I had brought only ordinary tools. He leaned closer to the window. "You can keep driving," he said. "You can die old in a small house where no one accuses you of the wrong crimes, but the question is still standing in your yard. You know the one?" My hands remembered a wheel I wasn't holding. My mouth remembered the shape of a stubborn man's no. The yes hovered, because it always does. He studied my face, like a clock. Then he smiled the way a teacher smiles when a safe child raises their hand for the dangerous answer. I didn't give him a yes, I gave him a story. I told him about the woman who had driven me to that diner and the way her kindness didn't ask for an invoice. And I told him about the day my brother laughed at something I said, and it felt like a skylight, finally remembering how to open. I told him about ordinary mornings where the coffee held steady in the cup, and the news didn't teach me a new word for disaster. I told him about the lists I made and how they got shorter. I told him that if he asked me, "Would you trade places with them if you could?" my mouth would say the brave thing, and my body would keep me honest. I told him that I wanted the game to end without another body taking my pose on the side of the road. He listened well. He is very good at it. Then he reached into his pocket and palmed another circle of wood. He did not show me the word. "It doesn't end," he said, with the calm of a man reciting a weather report. "It changes hands until a hand refuses to close." And he balanced the token on his fingertips like he might flip it and let fate pretend to be physics. It only takes one person to refuse the final trade. He waited. He didn't blink. He offered me a chance to be the kind of man whose refusal made a difference. I reached. I didn't take it. My fingers hovered over the grain where other thumbs had learned the curve. I thought of my brother's watch, the way time is a loop we believe is a line. I thought of the note. I thought of how debt collects language to excuse its appetite. I let my hand fall back to the wheel of a car I hadn't yet started. "And ask me your last one," I said, my voice careful as a man walking across his own roof. He obliged because ritual is a kindness if you squint. "Would you trade places if you could?" His question carried the weight of all the ones before it. I let the yes gather in my throat, then bury itself there, like a seed waiting for a different season. And I said no. I said it without flourish, as if the word had always been furniture in my mouth. He watched me put the window up, he watched me turn the key, he watched me pull away. In the mirror he grew smaller and no less certain, somewhere down the road. A life I might have taken kept traveling without me. I don't know if that makes me a thief or a man finally tired of stealing. I do know this. There are lights along the highway that will always flicker at the exact moment you want them to steady. There are questions that taste like metal when you try to chew them. There are games that recruit you with kindness. And there is a stranger who will stand where the pavement remembers how we fail each other. He will be waiting for someone else by morning. Maybe the next driver will hand him a life wrapped in fog and tired music, and maybe the next driver will refuse and discover that refusal isn't a cure, only a pause. I carry the watch, I make coffee, I tell the truth as if it could be rented by the hour. When night bends low enough, I drive past the places that used to loan me courage. I choose not to stop. Most nights the road offers me its quiet truce. Some nights I hear the game asking for players in the spaces between tires and line. I don't answer, but my hands remember the weight of wood and the cold that ran up my wrist. If you ever see me parked under a light that can't decide whether to be generous, don't worry. I'm only listening to a question I already answered. And if you roll down your window, if you volunteer your name like a small mercy, if you ask me where I'm headed, I'll tell you what I've learned to say. I'm going home. Not west, not anywhere you're going. Home is a place I finally owe the right things to. Story number 8. The call came after midnight. A thin voice delivered a warning, then vanished, leaving only the steady hush of an empty line and a road name I had promised myself I would never speak again. I picked up a stranger on a 2-lane cut through the pines. By the time I understood what he really was, I had already paid the toll. There are roads that take hours and roads that take names. Route 19 belongs to the second kind. When a trooper with sanded eyes told me I wasn't the first to see a man who never ages, I made the worst decision of my life. I went back to see if daylight could make a myth softer. Daylight didn't help. The map folded clean, my tank full, my courage rehearsed, and still the trees leaned in until they felt like walls, and the road decided what my engine could or could not do. Route 19 was the kind of road that never made it onto tourist maps. It cut through the forgotten heart of the state, bordered by dense pine forests and old abandoned farmhouses sinking into the earth. Locals avoided it after dark, muttering about accidents and disappearances, but for out-of-towners, it was just a shortcut. I was one of them, smug with directions and a timetable, certain that pavement was neutral and that fear was simply a story told over coffee. I told myself I would keep my eyes forward and my hands at 10 and 2, that the quick way through would be harmless, that the trees were only trees, one that promised to shave 30 minutes off the drive between two nowhere towns. Bought that promise and paid with attention I couldn't afford to lose. On a chilly November night, Amelia found herself on Route 19 for the first time. That sentence could be stamped across a drawer of reports and roadside gossip. I live inside it now, telling you what it felt like from the skin outward. She was behind schedule, I was behind grace, behind luck, behind every sensible choice I could have made an hour before. The road was empty. A dark seam stitched through the pines. the only light coming from her headlights and the thin star salt above. I rounded a bend and a shape flashed in her headlights. Not deer tall or mailbox square, but a figure standing at the edge of the road, arm raised, thumb out. The braking wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of decision you make before you admit you've made it. His outline settled into detail in the high beams. He wore an old-fashioned coat, salt dark and clean at the edges, and a battered fedora pulled low over his face. The hat brim turned his expression into guesswork. The satchel he held had worn corners, the kind you see on heirlooms and instruments. I lowered the window. "Need a ride?" The words were ordinary, and I wish I could tell you I meant them as a test, a ritual, a decoy, anything but an invitation. He nodded once and stepped in, placing the satchel on his knees as if its contents might bruise. "Where to?" I asked. He gave me not a destination but a direction. "Turn left at the next fork." After that, he went perfectly still. They drove in silence. The temperature in the car dropped the way a lake cools at dusk. In that quiet, I practiced questions and swallowed them, one by one. The way a child swallows stones to impress a dare. The forks came as promised. We crossed from pavement to rougher pavement, then to a seam of gravel that crackled under the tires like dry paper. The branches reached lower, closing in until my headlights had to push their way between them. When he finally spoke again, the instruction carried no room for argument. "Stop here!" I eased onto the shoulder. He opened the door and paused, one foot still in the car. The brim of his hat tilting toward me like a nod. "Thank you," he said. "Be careful on this road." Then he stepped into the trees and was gone. No rustle, no retreating crunch, just absence. Quick as a breath, I couldn't catch. 2 curves later, the night threw metal back at me. A sedan had folded around a pine, the hood crumpled like a fist. Steam lifted from the engine in white ribbons, and a woman stood in the ditch with both arms raised, her face bright with panic and blood. I parked and went to her, guiding her to the shoulder, tucking a blanket around her shoulders as her words tumbled. He was there, the man, in the lane. I swerved. I called for help and stayed until the sky turned ambulance red and help arrived to take over. The paramedics loaded the woman into the ambulance and the police took Amelia's statement. The air smelled like coolant and pine sap. My hands shook as if the steering wheel was still in them. A sergeant with a lined face, the kind of tired that belongs to people who keep showing up, looked me over the way a carpenter checks a board for warping. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked. I told him yes. "You're not the first?" His mouth made a tired line. "Every few months," he said, "someone gives the same description, coat, hat, quiet. Sometimes he asks for a ride, sometimes he stands where no car could miss him after he's gone. Something bad happens up the road. He didn't have to say the rest. But he did, for the record. Always the same description. Some say he's the ghost of a man killed here decades ago." He shrugged. "Others say he's a warning." He handed back my license like a verdict and told me to get some sleep, but she made it to her motel, but sleep was impossible. The room was a bright box where the night couldn't follow. But it did anyway. I lay awake and replayed the ride in frames, the satchel, the chill, the directions that arrived like coordinates I didn't remember asking for. Morning brought coffee and a forced promise to move on. For days I held to it. Then I didn't. She started seeing the hitchhiker everywhere, in dark windows that reflected the street like water, in the pause between elevator doors, in the patience of strangers waiting to cross. Rationality is a good anchor until the rope frays. One evening, weeks later, Amelia received a call from an unknown number. I was chopping onions when the screen lit with a name I didn't know. I answered without thinking. "Be careful on that road," the voice said, thin as paper. More idea than breath. "Not everyone comes back." The line died. No voicemail, no record, only a tension in my chest, like a sentence that refused to end. I should have drawn a red X over the map and never gone near it again. Instead, I went to the library because fear is easier to bear when you can stack it in clippings. I found a bus in 1957 that lost the bridge by a mile and never reached town. I found a farmer in 1972 who stepped out to fix a belt and spent hours walking in circles answering to a name that wasn't his. I found a postal truck in 1993 that drove the same 3 miles over and over until the carrier got out and walked home, leaving the truck neat on the shoulder like a folded shirt. The names in the stories repeated, a last name here, a first name there, as if the road kept a ledger and every so often took payment in letters. The next day, she decided to face her fear. I told no one. She drove back to Route 19 with the sun clean and the sky untroubled. She drove slowly, counting fence posts, measuring the spaces between trees with unlow, pretending that inventory could make the place harmless at a bend that looked like any other. The radio dissolved into a wide, shapeless hiss. The screen went grey, then black. The phone on the console dimmed to a dark mirror. The air in the car grew colder, but the cold had no source, no vent, no draft, only a rule I did not understand. Suddenly, the car stalled. Not a lurch, but a sure refusal. I tried the key once, then twice. Nothing. She reached for her phone, but it was dead. A silence I could not name settled over the trees. I opened the door. Warmth clung to the asphalt where the sun had set its hand earlier. No birds and no distant traffic. The world felt paused, waiting for me to decide which tale I belonged to. I called out, a simple request for help, but there was no reply. He stepped from the tree line as if the dark itself had let him go. The coat, the hat, the satchel. The stillness that was not lack but discipline. He stood a few feet away, letting me take in what I had come to see. Why me? I asked. He tipped his chin toward the road. Because you already know the way.
I won't drive you, I said. I won't be the next courier. He accepted that as if I had told him the time. There are other ways to move, he said, but not for me. Not anymore.
We stood in a careful silence. I thought of the bus, of the farmer with the wrong name, of the postal truck abandoned neat as a folded shirt. I thought of the sergeant staring down the road like an old enemy. I thought of the woman in the ditch with her arms lifted, and how relief had felt like stepping into a warm room. I stepped off the pavement onto the dirt fringe where weeds learn to live with passing tires. The man in the coat matched my pace, parallel but never nearer. The trees seemed to match us, too. They did not pass so much as rearrange. After 5 minutes of walking, the view had not changed. This was not distance, this was design. We trade more than we notice, I said, half to myself. Minutes for miles, certainty for speed, names for directions. He watched me with frank attention, then offered the barest nod, like a teacher conceding a point. It isn't me who collects, he said. It's the road. What does it collect? Departures, and the word felt heavier than it should. I pictured a ledger with lines and spaces, tidy columns, a place where my name could be written in letters, neat enough to impress a clerk from any year. Tell me where you were going, I said. He lifted the satchel a few inches, then set it down again. Home, he said. Once, I wanted a rule to break, a loophole, a way to injure the story without injuring myself. I put the key on the driver's seat and closed the door. I took the registration and slid it into my pocket as if paper could stand between me and a demand. If the road needs the car, it can have the car, I said. If it needs my assent, it will have to live without it. He watched me as though I had taken a step onto a stage. It's easier if you get in, he said. It always is. I shook my head. Not today. I began to walk again, listing the living things I could name to make this place feel less like a set. Ant, lichen, moss, jay, pine, then I named myself, quietly, but with both feet on the ground. Amelia. His head angled. Surprised not by the name but by the act of keeping it. We stood like that until a mustard-colored pickup rounded the bend. A couple sat inside mid-argument, their words low and ordinary. I raised my hand and they slowed. I looked back at the man in the coat. He did not plead, he did not smile. He simply abided. The way a tide abides. I had a choice. Wave the truck on and wait for another. Climb in and let the road use me. Attempt to outlast a design that had outlasted everyone who tried before me. Maybe there was a secret third path, maybe not. The versions of me who ran or fought both ended up back behind the wheel in the old shape of the story. I chose the version where I used someone else's engine to escape my own. I climbed into the pickup and gave the nearest cross street. The couple fell back into their small talk, restaurants gone, a nephew who loved trains. I kept my hands folded, practicing a calm that my chest refused to wear. At the corner, I thanked them and stepped down. The air felt heavy, as if a ledger had just been closed on a single entry. That night, I slept like a person under a weighted blanket. In the morning, I woke with the taste of iron and a certainty. This had been pause, not conclusion. Back on Route 19, the cycle continued. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but reliably enough to be learned the hard way. I did not go back. Not with the car, not on foot, but the road found other routes into my days. Sometimes the phone on the nightstand lit and went quiet, leaving no proof. Sometimes I passed hitchhikers far from pines and felt my palms prickle. On other roads, I still stopped now and then, but I learned to ask different questions. I looked at shoes and bags and the quality of a person's stillness. I looked for the patience that belongs to waiting rooms and border crossings, and I listened for the grammar of departure rather than the content of need. There are people who believe every story is a test of kindness. There are people who believe every story is a trap. I believe some stories are tools, sharp, useful, dangerous if handled wrong. Route 19 handed me such a tool and asked me to build a decision with it. I keep it wrapped in a sentence I finally learned to refuse. I will not repeat the words the phone taught me like a charm. I will not teach the road to anyone who hasn't already met it. And yet, even refusal has its limits. On certain nights, when the sky feels close and the town is quiet enough to count, I catch myself at the window, looking east toward the run of pines where county roads turn lean in the glass. My face wears the memory of a brim. I imagine the road as a wire drawn tight between hills, humming with names it has kept and names it is hungry for. I think of the man in the coat and the distances packed behind his eyes, and of the woman in the ditch whose life turned on an instant. I think of the sergeant and the way he spoke to the road like an old acquaintance he couldn't quite quit. A warning to those who dared to take the shortcut. I'm telling you mine, so you don't have to rent your own. If you see a hat where no hat should be, a coat in a season that doesn't fit, a satchel carried like a relic, slow down and keep moving. If a voice teaches you a phrase, let it die without your breath. If a map promises to shave minutes you can spare, pay with time instead. A reminder that not every passenger is what they seem, and not every road leads back to where you started. Story number 9. I used to wear kindness like armor. Now I count the blades it attracts. The night I braked for a stranger. The road memorized my name and started calling me back. He set a cool weight in my palm, and the world tilted just enough for everything familiar to slide. By the time the dreams learned my footsteps, I had already promised myself I would never run. If you need a map out of mercy, start here, at the door I opened and the one I keep shut. I was raised on small decencies: return the cart, wave first, take the call no one wants. Keep jumper cables in the trunk as if readiness itself were a prayer. People say such habits make you safe. They don't. They only make you visible to those who are looking. That evening, the countryside had the color of old brass. I was driving the back roads home, fatigue doing quiet arithmetic behind my eyes, when a car crouched on the shoulder like a wounded animal. Its hazards were blinking in the dusk, hazards blinking, and a man stood beside it, with his arms lifted as if surrendering to weather. I downshifted before I could think of reasons not to. His jacket was the wrong season for the wind. Thin jacket over a frame that looked like it hadn't slept. When he leaned into the soft interior light, I saw relief first, and gratitude second. "My car died," he said, then swallowed. Then added the kind of confession people save for strangers. "No one else stopped." I asked the responsible question, "Do you need a lift?" And watched his shoulders drop in the way of those who have been carrying more than an engine. He slid into the passenger seat and gave me a name that didn't feel like the first one he had practiced. Small talk found us because silence between strangers is an animal with its own teeth. He spoke of weather, of luck, of how dusk makes the edge of the world blurry. I noticed what he did not mention, where he lived. Who would be expecting him? Why his eyes kept darting to the rear-view mirror, as if it were a window opening on an open sea. When the town lights finally scattered themselves ahead of us like a handful of loose coins, he pointed to a motel whose sign sputtered between a vacancy and a promise. "Here," he said. His hands trembled while he fumbled the door, but instead of leaving, he turned back and set something into my palm. Wooden charm. No bigger than a rook. Edges smoothed by more than years. "For your trouble," he started, then caught himself and chose truer words. "For your kindness," he added a rehearsed instruction. "Keep it with you. It's important." The way he said "it's important" made the phrase feel borrowed, like clothing from a friend who now refuses to come to the door. I tried to hand it back. He shook his head and stepped away with a speed that looked like relief, misnamed as gratitude. The door to the motel swallowed him whole. In the car's dome light, the piece was ordinary and it was warm from his skin, but turned cool almost immediately, like breath on glass. There were symbols etched along its sides that seemed to repeat without repeating. I set it in the cup holder and told myself a story about old traditions and the stubborn pride of men who hate to owe strangers. The first dream arrived before I could forget his face. Forest, a lane without a lane, bare feet on soil that felt like a held breath, my lungs filling with the same. I was being followed, but the pursuit wasn't behind me. It ran parallel, invisible in the trees, we say, keeping pace, the way guilt keeps time. When I woke, the charm sat on my nightstand, though I never carried it upstairs. I convinced myself I was absent-minded and then rearranged my denial into neat little rows the way some people arrange coins. Little things unraveled first. My phone pretended not to know me. I came home to muddy footprints on the porch that were not mine and had the wrong stride. Twice in the office lot, a man in a thin jacket leaned against shadow like it owed him rent. When I looked full on, he turned into the honest shape of nothing. Don't be dramatic, I told myself. Traffic, stress, too much dark coffee. But anxiety is a good stenographer, and it kept the neatest notes. At lunch one day, a shape sat in the peripheral corner of my vision, the way a thought sits in the back pew when it doesn't want to be recognized. When I snapped my gaze there, the bench was empty. On my kitchen table, items arrived that did not belong to me. A watch with a cracked face that still kept accurate seconds. A faded photograph of a family whose smiles were blurred by age. And old car keys so stained, the numbers on the ring were mute. None of that made me cry. What shook me was the feeling that I had been misplaced. and was waiting on some other table in some other house for a woman who looked like me to come home and find me. I did what every modern pilgrim does, searched for a ritual online. The stories were not plentiful, but they rhymed in the wrong places. Strangers stranded by battered sedan or bad luck, tokens pressed into helpful hands, relief followed by nights that unspooled too slowly. A sentence appeared again and again, sometimes as warning, sometimes excuse. The only way to break the curse is to pass the charm on. Those who wouldn't pass it because they were good or because they were stubborn wrote about the way the air thinned in their halls, the way doors unlatched themselves, the way shadows felt less like absence and more like presence with its voice removed. I slept with the lights on and woke with the wooden charm under my pillow and a taste in my mouth, like a promise I had not made. I wanted to believe there was a third choice, keep the thing and keep myself. But wanting is a bridge that only spans half the river. There is a different kind of fear that belongs to the good, not the fear of being harmed, but the fear of becoming the person who harms. I stood in that narrow aisle for days. I took the charm to a librarian who knew how to make a quiet room feel like a confessional. She tilted the piece in the light, murmured about folkways and past burdens, about obligations that behave like contagious yawns. There are objects that borrow the momentum of decency, she said, because decency is the one thing people refuse to withhold. Her smile was brief and unhelpful. I thanked her and left with more vocabulary and the same problem. The object refused to remain where I set it. It learned where my pockets lived, and it settled into the space between my ribs and my resolve. In the grocery line, a man tapped my shoulder. And for a second, my body remembered the rearview mirror and went hollow with the idea of being followed. On the drive home, a billboard promised forgiveness for free. I imagined mailing the charm to the address and wondered whether sin had ever been that simple. In the forum threads, one post was written with the careful calm of someone timing their breathing. I kept mine, the stranger wrote, because I wouldn't do that to someone else. The final sentence arrived like a closed door. I am so tired now. I closed the browser and walked the perimeter of my house, touching the frames, inventorying what belonged to me, the clock late by 3 minutes, the ficus insisting on living, the mug with the chipped lip I always avoided. I said the names of my rooms aloud, and for a moment I felt protected by the sound of my own certainty. But the world began to answer in pairs. 2 knocks, 2 flickers of the hall light, 2 coins near the sink in a pattern that implied a third would complete something I didn't want completed. When I slept, the forest trail doubled back on itself and delivered me into the moment before I began to run. The parallel thing kept pace and, on a night I cannot forget, turned its head toward me, had my face, did not have my eyes. If this is punishment, for what? I asked the ceiling. The question measured the room and then came back shorter than when it left. When a person is drowning, the last choice is always the simplest one: breathe or stop. I told myself I would never pass the charm on. And then I met circumstance. Rain hung along the eaves like a curtain that wouldn't decide whether to fall. I was in the living room with a book I wasn't reading when footsteps arranged themselves on my porch boards. The knock was polite in the way of emergencies. I stood at the door and watched the peephole erase distance. A woman stood outside, water gleaming on her hair like small punctuation. The driveway behind her contained a car that sulked under a funereal blink, hazards blinking, and her mouth formed the same opening sentence I had heard from a man with a thin jacket. "I'm sorry," she said. "My phone's dead. The car won't turn. I just need to call the next town." The charm weighed my pocket like a verdict. A different life unfolded in my imagination, one where I did not open the door, one where I learned to grow stone where my compassion used to be. "You are not a gatekeeper," I told myself, "but you are a home." I opened. Her hands were cold in the way that feels like news. Her voice shook, but not from fear, more as if some invisible metronome had set too fast a tempo in her chest. I handed her a towel and a glass of water and my practiced calm. When she looked down at her shoes, I imagined the trail in my dreams and how my own bare feet had learned every route. I don't know that there was a right time to do it, only a true one, as she thumbed through my contacts. I pressed the piece into her palm and framed it with words I had once received, like instructions engraved on thin metal. "Take this, for your kindness," I said. And I heard someone else's voice inside mine. "Please, it's important." She stared at the small object, and I watched the first blink of recognition pass through her, the way a cloud passes over a field. Not shadow, just different light. Whatever she saw in my face convinced her that refusing would be worse than accepting. While the phone rang on speaker, the house sighed as if relieved. The space between the kitchen and the hall lost that crowded quality it had been carrying. The clock went back to being late by the same 3 minutes. When she left, she thanked me with a smile that tried to fold the moment into something small enough for a pocket. After the door clicked, I stood with both hands empty and felt 10 pounds lighter in places that had never been weighed. Sleep came like a bridge I could walk across without looking down. That night I did not run, and in the dream, the trail was just a trail. And the parallel thing did not appear because parallel is a shape for two. Morning moved through the rooms like a good rumor. The old photograph had returned to wherever the past stores its prints. The old car keys had gone. The watch returned to honest silence until I made coffee and tried to pray. But you cannot give thanks for something you bought with a currency you do not respect. What I had done was simple. What it meant would take longer. We like to believe the story ends when we do what the story demands. Endings are tidy only from a distance. Up close, they are just doors that suggest hallways. Days later, I saw a figure in the corner of my eye and braced out of habit, only to find a co-worker stepping into the break room with a sandwich and an apology. The ordinary startled me more than any shadow had. On the drive home, a car idled on the shoulder near a blind curb. Its profile too familiar. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I did the mean arithmetic we pretend we don't do. Probability, risk, how much daylight remained in the day itself. Keep going, I told myself. You are not the answer to every problem the world writes in the margins. I passed without stopping and hated the clean efficiency of it. The forums were worse than before. I read in the off hours, fingers hovering over the scroll like a gambler deciding when to stand. Some accounts ended in relief. Others trailed into ellipses that felt like telegrams with their verbs removed. A phrase repeated in me whether the screen was lit or not. It isn't gone, it has only moved its address. I had done what many had done. I had sent the letter on. When guilt speaks, it wears many uniforms. Some nights it dressed as philosophy. If a burden is designed to be shared, is sharing it cruelty or compliance? Some nights it dressed as common sense. If you had kept it, you might have stopped it. And then there were nights when it wore its true name and called itself fear. Because the truth is that the world contains more dams than rivers. And every dam breaks somewhere. I stopped leaving my porch light off, kept my phone charged, and I turned down the kind of late invitations that yield driveway conversations and extra cups of coffee, but I also kept the cables in the trunk. I would not make a god of caution. When the town threw a harvest fair, people I loved stood under paper lanterns and laughed the way people do when they are busy trying to hold a season steady. On the far side of the square, a woman paused beside a game booth. Her face tilted as if listening for her name in a crowd. I recognized the expression, not because I had seen it on others, but because I had worn it myself. The look of someone newly aware of the weight you cannot set down in public. I almost walked over then. I almost asked the question we do not ask. Were you the one who left my house lighter? But I stopped with the question still an egg in my mouth. If she carried what I had once carried, she did not need my witness. If she carried nothing at all, I would be the storm I was trying not to become. That night, a quiet settled in me that was not relief and not dread. It was the third thing, the kind of quiet that comes from getting the ending you deserve rather than the ending you want. Sometimes when I drive the back roads late, I still pass a car with hazards blinking, still see a shape raising its arm against the weather. I don't pretend not to see them. I don't always stop. Mercy, like braking, has to be measured against the curve ahead and the traffic behind and the way your hands are shaking on the wheel. I talk to them in the way we talk to people we can't risk.
Someone will come, I say, in the air between us. Someone always does.
If you are reading this to learn what to do when the weight finds you, I have only this. And it is not advice so much as inventory. Carry a light that reaches the ditch. Keep your number written somewhere that does not need a battery. Know the shape of your own fear so you'll recognize when someone hands you a piece carved in its likeness. And remember, there are debts that cannot be paid, only moved. On my kitchen shelf sits a small space where the charm would fit if it had ever belonged to me. Sometimes I stand in front of it with a cup cooling between my hands and let myself imagine a life in which I kept the peace and managed to throttle its hunger with sheer stubbornness. In that life, I become the kind of person who refuses to hand anything terrible to anyone else, no matter the cost. In that life, I leave my porch light on and hold my door unlocked far too often, so I'm in that life. I do not sleep. In this life, I have learned to live with the compromise that comes from loving the kind of world that uses tenderness as a lever. I live with the knowledge that the debt did not vanish. It merely found a new accountant. I try to be useful in the old ways without becoming a road hazard of my own. If you find a stall on a long shoulder and a stranger with a story that fits in a glove compartment, know that I have been both people, the rescuer and the one rescued into trouble. If you are handed a token and a line that sounds like a script, listen for the echo in it. The only way to break the curse is a sentence written by the thing that benefits. Now, if you must carry it with your eyes open. So if you must gift it, understand that gifts can be knives if you press them hard enough. There are nights when the route home offers me a tableau, a car angled wrong at a curve, a figure waving in the darkness, a question laid out across the pavement like a net. I lift my foot, I lower it. I say the words that have become my weather, the same words I spoke into my own steering wheel the week after I let the weight go. Waiting for the next Good Samaritan is not a plan, it is a warning. I am still kind, I am just no longer unarmed. And because some lines want the last word, because the road insists on having a conscience, I will leave you with the one sentence that keeps its edge, even in daylight. Some debts can never be repaid. Story number 10. An unknown passenger who knows your full name isn't a passenger. It's a decision you already made. A debt wears a raincoat, not apologies, and waits where the light hesitates. Drivers think they steer. The road does the arithmetic. He cuddled a canvas bag like a parachute. I read it as a knot tied to his throat. I wasn't the weather tonight. I was the receipt. I tell this plainly because detail is a form of mercy. My name is Harper, and I work the margins where money forgets to leave a memo. Some call it skip tracing, some call it collections. What I do is simpler. I follow pressure until it finds an opening. The rain was relentless, a curtain that turned the city into reflections of reflections, hammering the windshield in sheets until every surface looked honest. The first time I saw Jake in my mirror, the glass made him taller and smaller at once. He leaned into the wheel like a man trying to nudge the night into compliance. Jake gripped the steering wheel, and there was a tremor in it that didn't belong to the storm. He was running late again, not by the clock, but by the unpaid promises stacked behind him. He had that hunted softness around the mouth I know too well. The tell you see in gamblers during the last hand they pretend isn't the last. I had studied him long enough to know which fuel stations he trusted, which alleys he respected, which names made him swallow, The file said he was gifted at reading people, almost superstitious about spotting trouble before it found him. But exhaustion waters down talent. He needed to get out of town fast. Runners say the same thing in different accents. Distance as absolution, but distance is only a calendar with scenery. When he almost reached the ramp that promised a way, I stood where reflections cross. A woman in a dark raincoat beneath a flickering street lamp, thumb out, face kept in shadows by the shiver of bad wiring. He slowed. He weighed what he'd been taught against what he wanted to be true. His window hummed down, and the warm breath of the car met the wet air between us. "Need a ride?" he asked, trying to sound casual and landing on careful. I nodded once, drew the hood a fraction lower, and climbed in with the practiced quiet of someone taught to be furniture when necessary. He offered a name as if it could lower the stakes. "I'm Jake." I let the silence live a moment and gave him mine anyway. "Call me Harper." He drove like a man listening for an instruction he couldn't quite hear. The city's glow dissolved, the road unwound. Lightning stitched the horizon and pulled its thread back through. He kept sneaking glances, trying to measure me without a ruler. I watched the lines on the glass. The wipers stopped being a metronome and became a rehearsal. "Do you always pick up strangers?" I asked. He tried on a laugh that didn't fit. "Not usually." "You trust too easily," I said, and it landed somewhere between warning and wind. We bled into a town with one open station and a memory of better days. He pulled in. I fetched 2 coffees and salt in a paper bag. Back in the cab, I watched him study the lid like it could tell the future. His hand drifted toward the glove box. My eyes followed without hurrying. He noticed my noticing and let his fingers retreat. He had questions he couldn't ask without confirming his fear. I spared him the confession and offered the conclusion. "You're not just driving," I said. "You're measuring the distance between the last mistake and the next." His breath snagged. In the trunk was a duffel bag in his trunk. Currency sweating under canvas, sold to him as a ticket to freedom by men who knew how to pronounce the word interest. He'd made a mistake, a big one, and there were people who didn't believe in second chances tracing his heat like hunters follow fog. He tried to square his shoulders into a more durable shape. "Who are you working for?" he asked. The question tasted like iron. I took in the shine of the wet concrete, the lonely clatter of the sign chain, the cashier pretending not to look. "Does it matter?" I asked. And something behind his eyes admitted that it did, and that he couldn't afford to know. Headlights stitched the windows white. 2 cars pulled into the gas station, boxing him in. 4 doors opened, one after another, like a sentence completing itself. Men in dark jackets stepped out with the calm of people who had practiced this ending. I opened my door without ceremony and stepped into rain that wrapped me in pins. "Sorry, Jake," I said, and meant it in the tiny way a surgeon means it. "It's just business." That is the version everyone prefers. Jake was gone by morning, but the ledger of that night isn't a straight column, and the truth doesn't travel in a single vehicle. They weren't my men, not exactly on eye to eye. My clients often rent muscle the way some people rent tuxedos, rarely, badly, and to make a point louder than their voice. These 4 had a different smell, closer to freelance harm than contract compliance. They wanted the bag, the story, and the kind of silence you can stack bodies under. I don't do vanishings. Retrieval has rules, so I wrote new ones. I lifted my hands to the rain, empty and conversational. He walks away lighter, you walk away richer. I told their lead, a silhouette sketched from shortcuts. He didn't answer. Another set of beams slid across the pumps, too slow for chance, too steady for panic. My lookout was nearby. The quiet hum I'd felt in my pocket earlier wasn't a text. It was a rhythm code. We needed a minute of chaos followed by 3 minutes of certainty. I leaned toward Jake's window and pitched my voice for the cameras. "Take the bag," I said, firm enough to sound like command, soft enough to pass as a confidence. His eyes met mine in the mirror and snagged on something he didn't expect to find there. Not mercy, not cruelty, permission. He held still. Stillness is the only speed that beats a swarm. They pried open the trunk and unzipped hope. Wet bills have a particular smell, like a choir that can't agree on the melody. They congratulated themselves by making small jokes, the kind men make when they're afraid to admit the arithmetic of consequence. I let them. Pride is a blindfold you can drape over your own eyes and pretend is shade. Inside, I bought a roll of mints I didn't want and change I didn't need. The clerk had the expression of someone who understood that some nights are essays on how to keep your job. I asked to see the register, and he shrugged the way men shrug when they decide a stranger might fix what the weather breaks. A camera wire ran through a conduit with a gap a mouse could navigate. I killed the feed into a loop long enough to convince tomorrow that nothing unusual had happened, and then turned it back on so there'd be proof for the part of the story where paper needs witnesses. Outside, the men counted. I offered a receipt they didn't ask for and said the word premium like a person setting terms. The lead told me to disappear. I said I understood. He didn't notice the second tracker. Men who find the first pat themselves down like heroes and never suspect they were applauding the wrong trick. I placed the second in the seam of his jacket when I reached up to straighten a thread that wasn't there. I do this work with hands that learned how to steal back the breath a room tries to take. When they pulled away with the bag and the certainty that comes seconds before regret, I let them go. My lookout rolled by and matched my speed as I walked. The window low, the engine polite. "Left or right?" he asked. "Both," I said. "Warehouse first, then the river." The night took our taillights and folded them into itself. Back in the station, the clerk printed proof, mints, coffee, the price of acting natural. Paper is a leash you can put on memory. I returned to Jake, who watched me like a man trying to read the weather off my face and not the sky. He asked if he could leave. "You made your choices," I said, letting the earlier line sit where it landed. "And now you live with them." Language is a tool. Sometimes it's a key, sometimes a mirror. He stared like he'd seen himself arrive where he'd been headed all night. He told me about the deal, about the way easy money speaks in lullabies, BC, about the threats that sound reasonable when you're tired. He said he believed the road doesn't care who you are or what you're running from. He was half right. The road cares, just not the way people hope. It keeps the score. "Do you want to quit owing?" I asked. He nodded, as if the motion could become a vow. We split there, so he could practice staying, and I could practice finishing. I left him his knife. Some lessons shouldn't be learned unarmed, and the coffee, which was courage pretending to be caffeine, and I kept one decision to myself: to check on him once the math balanced. The bag toured a warehouse that used to make promises and now made excuses. My clients arrived in their tidy coats with their tidy penmanship. They wanted a loop closed, a press release drafted, and a conscience they could rent by the quarter hour. I gave them a narrative with receipts, the men, the bag, the map, the trackers. They signed, nodded, and shook hands with the air to avoid smudging anything that might look like guilt. Somewhere between the signatures, a phone lit with a name nobody used in daylight. The lead from the station made the call I knew he would. To sell what he'd just stolen again. People like him can't resist the second bite. That's where the hooks are. We followed the jacket seam across town, a slow pulse on a little screen, until it stopped at a door too tired to pretend it was locked. The room inside smelled like bad plans and newer paint. I let them take inventory of the future they thought belonged to them. Then I flipped the lights and the mood with the same switch. My people moved like grammar: subject, verb, object, period. The bag returned to the table like a repentant idea. The men who had practiced endings learned about revisions. When everyone found their place in the paragraph, I collected my fee, which for nights like this is measured in money and in the way the world briefly lines up with the version of me that can sleep. At a diner with a sign that blinked between open and pen, I found Jake sitting on a curb with a newspaper he wasn't reading. Dawn had taken the sharpness out of the rain and left the city rinsed. I stood where he could decide to look or not. He looked. "So," he said, "am I a witness or a corpse they forgot to count?" "Neither," I said. "You're alive because you adjusted." He nodded like he wanted to agree with the word and not the work required to make it true. I handed him a folded address with a door that didn't lock from the outside. "Show up," I said. "Tell the truth in complete sentences. A rumor will say I'm forever waiting under that lamp, standing beneath a flickering street lamp, hand raised, asking, 'Need a ride?' and disappearing into cars that don't belong to me. The rumor will say I change names when traffic thins. It's wrong. I don't change the name. Call me Harper. I change the arithmetic." Before I left, I told him the part most people call a threat, and I call a map. If you run, the next person won't bring a ledger. They'll bring a shovel. He didn't argue. He folded the address once, then again, like repetition could make courage permanent. You're not as hard to find as you think. People talk, especially when there's money involved. He managed a smile that wasn't quite a lie. Elsewhere, another storyteller will write that night the old way, that he tried to escape and there was nowhere to go, that they dragged him from the car, that the duffel bag drowned in the dark, that the police wrote it off, that those who knew Jake whispered, double-crossed, that Harper was still walking, waiting for the next mark, the next debt to collect. They'll say again that the road doesn't care who you are or what you're running from. They'll be half right. The road cares about balance. It always did. If you need an ending, keep this one. I still prefer rain because it makes the city honest. I still stand where light flickers because hesitation is a confession. Rumor insists I plan the weather. I don't. I only carry a ledger and a difficult tolerance for mercy. When the next driver slows, the window slips down, and a voice asks the oldest question. I lean toward the map and answer, half verdict, half invitation. Need a ride? Half. Story number 11. I kept telling myself the horizon owed me a change, but the line never bent. 5 miles past the last memory of a town, the dark felt like a vow I had already broken. I used to believe every road contained an ending. Tonight it felt like the road contained me. I had a tank full of diesel and a name that didn't help, Eli, and neither did a thing against a sky that refused to move. When the three of them stepped out of the night, my hands tightened on the wheel as if pressure alone could make the world choose a different route. The night was endless, and I knew it before I saw them. The road stretched on forever, and something inside me answered to that shape. My route sheet said a straight shot across the plains. The clock on the dash made a silent march, but the world outside held its breath. The cab smelled like coffee I no longer tasted and dust that had followed me for states I couldn't name anymore. They stood near the shoulder. In a patch of light, my high beams flattened into silver. 3 figures standing by the roadside, palms raised, the old signal everybody knows. A young woman in a denim jacket, hair pulled back, eyes that didn't blink. Beside her, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit, face set to neutral the way people do when they have lost the habit of asking for anything, and an old man with a cane, his posture stubborn, his mouth working around words I couldn't hear yet.
I told myself, no, keep rolling. I told myself the stories I've heard, drivers who slowed and then lost more than time, but their shapes leaned toward the road the way sunflowers lean toward a light they can't keep. I braked and let the rig come to a compliant halt. I slid the passenger window down, and offered the question that felt like a coin tossed into a deep well. "Where are you headed?"
The young woman's voice met the air without echo. "Just down the road. Anywhere you're going." I unlocked the door before I could find a second thought. "Climb in." They fit along the back bench as though the seat had been built with their bodies in mind. The young woman folded her hands with the care of someone holding a secret. The man in the suit settled his gaze on the glass, set his jaw. The old man balanced the cane across his knees and blinked like he had to remember to do it. I pulled us back into motion and let the white lines pass beneath my wheels like stitched thread. For a while, I tried small talk, the kind pilots use when the landing gear is delayed, gentle sentences that keep the roof from feeling too low. They answered in sketches. "We're just travelers," the young woman said, looking for a way out. The phrase landed between us like a box with no label. I kept waiting for a sign, a town name, a speed limit that changed, a billboard offering a last chance at a museum nobody ever visits. Kept waiting for the radio to choose a station. None of it made the smallest move. No signs, no exits, just the same flat horizon stretching into the dark. I glanced down. Eli checked his GPS, but the screen was blank. The map frozen. I tried the radio and got a texture instead of a song, nothing but static. I told myself to relax. Straight roads mess with you. Level land steals distance. And I told myself I was tired, that I'd slept wrong at the truck stop. That time gets slippery when the world offers nothing to push against. But the day I stopped trusting coincidences was the day I started driving for a living. I reached for certainty and found only more wheel. This road should have ended by now. Where the hell are we? I didn't really mean to say it out loud. The old man's mouth tugged into something that didn't want to be called a smile. "You'll see," he said. "It always looks the same." The sentence chilled through me, not because it was ominous, but because it was bored. The man in the suit finally turned away from his window. He had the kind of eyes that made absence look like a decision. "You're not the first to pick us up. You won't be the last." The young woman leaned forward. Her voice didn't waver. It made a straight line, the way a surveyor's string ignores valleys and rock. "You can't stop. You can't turn back. The road doesn't let you." The steering wheel felt warmer under my palms, like something alive had decided to wake inside it. "You're trying to scare me," I said, aiming for light, missing. "I keep a lot of things in this truck," I told them. "Spare fuses, maps that never helped, coffee that pretends to be coffee, a faith enough to get from one fuel island to the next." The old man nodded like I'd recited a prayer he had once believed. "I don't keep myths," I added. The miles said nothing. The sky said nothing. The engine gave me what I asked of it, no more, no less. I pressed deeper on the pedal. He pressed the accelerator, pushing the truck faster, desperate to find a sign, a turn-off. Anything. The world honored my effort with identical scenery, but the road stayed the same. The horizon unchanging. So I made the move the stubborn make. I eased onto the shoulder and let the truck stand. Gravel formed a small sound under the tires I refused to hear twice. I faced the bench. "Get out," I said. "I'm done." The old man regarded the door, then me. The way a teacher measures whether a student is ready for the next lesson. "You can't leave us. You're part of it now." I reached for the handle with the moral force of the reasonable thing. The cab breathed cold. When I turned back, the seat was as bare as the road beyond it. A smell, like rain that never arrives, touched the air. Against every instinct I owned, I listened and found voices where mouths were not. "Keep driving," they said. My hand knew the ignition by heart. The truck moved because I told it to. I moved because something else told me to. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time felt slippery, unreal. The three of them returned, as if the cab had been reprinted with them already inside. And with them came stories that felt less like sentences and more like rooms we stepped into.
There was a woman here, the young one said, eyes tilting toward a place no window could display. She promised herself just this once, and promised the road the same. She tried to be generous and left us where the fence line breaks. She kept her promise and still ended up here.
And a man, the suit said. He made a plan. Plans like to imagine they are stronger than landscapes. He slid his tongue over dry lips. He pressed himself against the wheel until his hands shook. He named every line of paint he crossed as if naming were magic. The road took the names and gave him the same view in return. The old man waited for the others to set the table with their truths, then placed a cup in the middle. Once, he said, I walked. I gave the road my back and my shoes. The sky pretended it cared. I got thirsty and learned that thirst is a way of counting. When I turned around, the truck I had left was resting by the same mile I began at, and I was standing next to it. He told it like he was telling me how to fix a hinge. I wanted to laugh for the sake of having one thing I could do that felt free. Laughter didn't arrive. I turned the wheel until the motion hurt my shoulder and made the trailer nod, and I dragged the truck across the center line, then across it again, as if weaving could unbraid a spell. I drove slow. I drove faster. I tried a prayer I'd given up on years ago, closing my eyes at a straight stretch, the kind of sin you confess by not doing again. Every choice carried the same receipt.
Somewhere between miles that refused to be numbered, the fighting left me. Eventually, he stopped fighting. I didn't know if the sentence belonged to me or if I had picked it up from one of them. Surrender is a strange word. It makes you think of white flags and finality. What I did felt quieter, like placing an object back on a shelf where it had always lived.
Acceptance didn't make me kind, but it made me clear. The three of them studied me the way people study a mirror. Not to see the glass, but to watch themselves become correct. I settled into the work of distance without destination. The ethical effort of momentum. He understood now. The road wasn't a place. It was a trap. A cycle that fed on those who stopped, who offered help, who dared to let strangers in. I let the truth sit in the passenger seat. Buckled, a model citizen. When you drive in an enclosed universe, small changes feel like weather. The girl sometimes hummed a tune so old it didn't remember itself. When the sound came, the air went velvet. The man in the suit kept his tie straight with the focus of a surgeon. The old man tapped the cane once against the floorboard without sound, as if counting, as if refusing to give even rhythm to the night. They told me everything and nothing. They spoke of towns that existed for them but didn't for me, of exits that led to fields where wind wrote its name over and over until it forgot the spelling. They described drivers who tried bargains, drivers who tried rage, drivers who tried love, one who spoke the names of her children into the windshield until the glass fogged with her effort. Sometimes I watched my headlights touch another pair far ahead, faint as coins on the bottom of a river. I'd call out, hand raised, voice pitched to warn, mouth forming the start of a sentence like a flare. Turn around. Don't. Please. But the warning stayed behind my teeth, as if the cab had rules about what could leave it. Sometimes, Eli would see another set of headlights in the distance, another driver slowing down, rolling down their window, and I knew what came next because the road likes to repeat itself, and each time, a new passenger would climb aboard, their eyes wide with hope, unaware of the loop they were entering. I asked the old man his name. He tilted his head as if the question were a photograph taken at a bad angle. I had one, he said at last. I used it long enough to wear it thin. The suit volunteered nothing, the girl answered. You already know? I nodded as if I did. The truck and I made a treaty. I promised to listen, it promised to move. At intervals, that meant nothing. I checked the side mirror and caught sight of a face that was mine, arranged like a mask designed by someone who had only read about me. The last time Eli looked in the rearview mirror, he saw his own face staring back, hollow and tired. Just like the others, the sentence was a door I had been approaching without admitting it. I thought of the first time I drove at night for pay, a warm wind and a sense that I had joined a river that was glad of me. I thought of a diner where the waitress called me hon because she'd chosen kindness as a habit. I thought of the way the sun, on certain mornings, climbs the world with a tired hero's patience. Those memories came like postcards sent from a country that had stopped delivering mail.
A person wants to assign blame. If the world is a machine, then somewhere there must be a lever, a switch, a panel with a warning label. If the world is a story, there must be a reason beyond because. But I had the feeling all along that this road had been here before roads were ideas, before maps learned to be smug about their boxes. And I had the feeling it would be here after drivers forgot to dream of an end.
I found a rhythm, not of sleep, not of wakefulness, but of continuing. Fuel arrived when it had to. The needle made private arrangements. Hunger lived in my mouth like a tenant who always paid on time. Thirst felt like a posture more than a need. The truck held, the tires sang a low note that might have been prayer if I believed. I learned to measure myself by the width of the lanes. One night, or what wore the clothing of a night, I tried a new approach. I cut the headlights and steered by what the engine and the bones of the road told me. The dark didn't change its mind about me. I turned them back on and the world returned in the same outfit. The girl asked if I remembered the first time I had ever offered help. "You were young," she said, as if I had been a friend of hers once. "Briefly, you took a box too heavy for an older man. You made a face like the weight would crack you and then it didn't." I nodded. The suit adjusted his tie. The old man held the cane like a signature. It took me a long time to accept I had begun to speak like them. Clean lines, spare information, no promises. It took me longer to see that the road had given me a gift, the end of pretending I had control over anything beyond how I held the wheel. The road stretched on, endless and unforgiving. Somewhere ahead, far enough to pretend distance mattered. A shape waited near the shoulder, a single arm lifted in a gesture the world taught us all, and somewhere up ahead, another hitchhiker stood by the roadside, thumb out, waiting for the next driver to stop. This time, I felt something shift in me, not mercy, not malice, recognition. I guided the truck to a measured halt. I didn't ask myself whether I would, whether I should. Stories like mine are branchless. The cab cooled. I watched the figure approach as if the night had breathed it out. My hands lay on the wheel like two creatures who had made peace with each other. A face appeared in the window I already knew, because I had seen it at a distance in another truck I couldn't warn, because mirrors say more than we ever ask them to. The person on the shoulder climbed up, sat down, folded their hands the way the girl always did. He wore a suit. He carried a cane. She had a denim jacket. The endless ride continued, claiming another soul, another story, another night that would never end. I did not bless them or curse them. I did the only true thing left to me. I drove.